had been planning this cabin trip for months. The idea of being completely isolated in the woods, away from people, phones, and the constant noise of the city had become a sort of obsession for me. I wanted silence, I wanted peace, but I also wanted to test myself, to see what it would be like to survive alone, relying only on my skills and instincts. I had done plenty of hiking and camping before, nothing extreme, but enough to know how to handle myself in the wilderness. I packed my backpack meticulously, making sure I had all the essentials. Food for a week, plenty of water, a stove, a first aid kit, a lantern, a couple of flashlights with extra batteries, a tent in case the cabin wasn't as solid as I thought, and a rifle. I didn't plan to hunt, but I knew carrying a rifle was a good idea in case I ran into trouble. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet. I left late in the morning, taking back roads to avoid highways. The GPS signal disappeared halfway through, and I was left navigating by the small printed map I had made from online sources. The cabin was supposed to be deep in the forest, far from any other houses or trails. When I finally reached the last stretch of dirt road, the tires of my car kicking up dust, I could see it. A small wooden structure tucked between tall pines and surrounded by dense underbrush. It looked untouched, like no one had been there for years. I parked and stepped out, taking a deep breath of the crisp forest air. It smelled of damp earth and pine needles, clean and sharp. The cabin was simple: one room, a small loft, a fireplace, and a creaky wooden porch. The windows were dusty, the door slightly warped, but it looked solid. I unpacked my bag and carried everything inside. My plan was to stay for 7 days, maybe 8 if I felt like it. The first day was uneventful. I organized the cabin, stacked firewood neatly, cleaned the fireplace, and unpacked my food. I explored the immediate surroundings, noting a small stream about 100 meters away and a narrow trail that seemed to wind through the forest. Birds chirped occasionally, and I saw deer tracks near the stream. I even spotted a fox disappearing between the trees. Everything felt peaceful, even idyllic. By the time night fell, I had a small fire going in the fireplace, the cabin glowing warmly, and I felt a sense of satisfaction. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times, disoriented in the darkness. The forest outside was alive with sounds. The distant howl of a coyote, the rustle of branches as animals moved unseen, and the occasional crack of a fallen branch. I reminded myself this was normal. These were the sounds of nature. The second day, I decided to explore more. I followed the narrow trail deeper into the forest, taking note of landmarks so I could find my way back. The forest thickened quickly, the trees older and closer together. I saw more animal tracks, deer, raccoons, maybe a bear. I tried not to think about the bear too much. Bears were dangerous, yes, but if I kept calm, they usually left humans alone. The sun was high when I realized I had walked further than intended. I checked my map and tried to figure out the way back. That's when I noticed the first unnerving sign. There, near a bend in the trail, were deep tire tracks, fresh and heavy. Not from a car, too narrow, like an ATV or a small off-road vehicle. Someone had been here recently. I froze, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I had expected birds or rustling, but everything seemed to have paused. I decided to turn back immediately, walking fast, ears straining for any sound. The forest felt different on the way back. The shadows seemed longer, darker. Every snap of a twig made me jump. When I finally saw the cabin again, relief washed over me. I locked the door, even though it had a simple latch, and placed the rifle by the bed. I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. The woods were full of signs of animals and humans alike. I had no proof anyone was near the cabin. Still, the feeling lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The next morning, I woke early to the sound of something outside. Not animal sounds, not the wind, but a rhythmic, deliberate crunching through the underbrush. I grabbed my rifle and moved cautiously to the window. Between the trees, I saw nothing, only shadows. But I could feel it, the sense that someone was watching. My heart pounded, but I forced myself to breathe. Whoever it was, I thought, must be far away. I had been alone in the woods before. People often hiked these trails. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. I spent most of the day inside, chopping wood and reinforcing the door as best as I could. I didn't want to leave the cabin now. By afternoon, I thought the sounds had stopped, so I went to the stream to refill my water. The walk was tense. I kept glancing behind me, scanning the shadows. When I returned, I noticed the porch looked different. One of the logs I had stacked neatly for the fire was now lying on the ground, far from where I had placed it. My stomach sank. That night, sleep was impossible. Every rustle, every snap of a branch, every gust of wind against the cabin set me on edge. I didn't dare leave the bed, keeping the rifle close. I realized that this was the first time I had ever felt truly vulnerable in the wilderness. Not because of the forest itself, but because of the idea that someone could be out there watching, waiting. By the fourth day, the fear had settled into a constant tension. I kept the fire going constantly, moving around the cabin to check windows and doors, listening for any sound outside. I noticed marks in the dirt near the porch, small footprints that hadn't been there before. They weren't human shoes, but bare feet or soft boots. Someone had been walking near my cabin while I slept. I tried to rationalize it, maybe hikers, maybe someone camping nearby. But the tracks weren't on any trail, and they ended abruptly in the woods, as if whoever they were had vanished. I stayed inside for most of the day, rationing my food and water carefully. I started to think about what I would do if someone tried to break in. I moved furniture to block the door, tied a rope across the entrance as an improvised alarm, and kept the rifle loaded. I slept with it in my arms, every noise outside making me flinch. The woods, once beautiful and serene, now felt menacing. Every rustle could hide a threat, every shadow a person waiting to strike. On the fifth day, I had an idea. I would leave the cabin briefly, check the nearby area for signs of whoever had been there. I didn't want to stay trapped inside, but I also didn't want to walk unprepared into danger. I packed a small bag with the rifle, a flashlight, and a knife, and stepped into the forest. I moved carefully, sticking to areas where I could see clearly. I found more tracks, fresh ones this time, leading from the cabin deeper into the woods. Whoever had been near me was still here. I followed them cautiously, trying to remain downwind and unseen. After hours of tracking, I realized the tracks led to an old, abandoned hunting shack I hadn't noticed before. It was hidden between trees partially collapsed, overgrown with vines. The door hung on one hinge, and inside, I could see old equipment, animal pelts, and a faint smell of decay. I didn't linger. Whoever had been near my cabin might have been using this as a base. I took note of the location and headed back quickly. I decided not to confront anyone. Survival meant avoiding unnecessary risks. That night, I reinforced the cabin even more. I placed heavy furniture against all entrances, set traps around the perimeter using makeshift alarms, and kept the rifle loaded and close. I stayed awake most of the night, watching the shadows, listening to the forest. Around dawn, I heard faint noises, soft but deliberate. Someone was walking near the cabin. I could see a shadow move between trees, then disappear. I held my position, making no sound. By the time the sun rose, there was no sign of anyone. The sixth day was tense but uneventful. I stayed inside, only leaving briefly to check the stream for water. I noticed that some food had been moved slightly, as if someone had been there while I was away. I couldn't confront them directly. I didn't know if they were armed or dangerous. My only option was to wait it out, remain vigilant, and make the cabin as difficult to enter as possible. By the seventh day, I realized I had been through a week of fear, constant vigilance, and tension unlike anything I had experienced before. The woods had transformed from a place of peace into a threatening maze, each sound a warning, each shadow a potential intruder. I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly, leaving the cabin as organized as I could, and started the walk back to the dirt road. I kept my rifle ready, scanning constantly. The walk out was nerve-wracking, but I encountered no one. The tracks near the cabin had disappeared, the forest quiet as though nothing had happened. When I finally reached the road and my car, relief was overwhelming. I locked the doors, got inside, and drove as fast as the rough terrain allowed, without taking my eyes off the forest. Looking back, I realized that the experience had changed me. The cabin trip, which I had envisioned as peaceful solitude, had become a lesson in vigilance, awareness, and survival. I had faced fear in its rawest, most human form, not supernatural, not imaginary, but real. The fear of another person with unknown intentions, alone in the wilderness, powerless if confronted. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, this time with friends, and found nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of intruders. The forest had reclaimed the tracks, the cabin was quiet, and the sense of menace had vanished. I repaired the minor damages, strengthened the door, and left again. But I knew that if I ever returned alone, I would never underestimate the reality of being isolated in the woods. The experience taught me caution, respect for the environment, and the need to prepare not just for nature, but for the possibility of other humans who may pose a threat. It was terrifying, exhausting, and yet strangely empowering. I survived, I learned, and I understood fully that solitude in the wilderness carries a weight that no amount of planning or skill can completely eliminate. The fear is real, but survival is possible, as long as you stay alert, aware, and ready. I had been looking forward to this cabin trip for months. The idea of being completely alone in the forest, away from people, phones, and noise, felt like the only way I could reset after the year I had endured. The cabin itself was not fancy. It was a simple wooden structure tucked into a thick patch of trees at the edge of a mountain clearing, but I liked that. Promised isolation and silence, and that was exactly what I wanted. The drive up had been long and winding. My car, loaded with supplies and a heavy backpack, had creaked and rattled along narrow gravel roads that were barely wide enough for two vehicles. The sky had been overcast, the clouds a dull gray, the kind that made everything seem muted and heavy. By the time I reached the clearing, the sun had begun its slow descent, throwing long shadows across the forest floor and tinting the treetops a pale, sickly gold. The first thing I noticed about the cabin when I stepped out of the car was how quiet it was. The air smelled of damp leaves, pine, and something faintly metallic that I could not identify at first. There were no birds, no insects, no wind. It was the kind of quiet that feels like it's waiting for something, and I had a sudden twinge of unease, the kind that prickles at the back of your neck but isn't yet fear. I shrugged it off. I had been in forests before, had spent nights camping alone, and I knew that my mind could turn normal silence into something sinister if I let it. The cabin was small, roughly 20 by 20 feet, made of unpainted logs that had weathered to a dull gray. Its roof was covered with moss and fallen leaves. There was a small porch with two wooden chairs, both covered in dust, and a door with a rusty latch that opened without resistance. Inside, it smelled of wood, old smoke, and damp earth. There was a stove in one corner, a single bed with a thin mattress, and a table with a few chairs. A small window looked out over the clearing, through which I could see the dense forest stretching in every direction. I set my bag down and began unpacking, feeling a small thrill at the thought of being completely alone for the next 3 days. As the evening grew darker, I lit the stove and boiled water for tea. The cabin was cold, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you feel hollow. I wrapped myself in a blanket, sitting on the edge of the bed and listening to the forest outside. Everything was still, too still, and that quiet gnawed at me. I tried to distract myself by unpacking more supplies, checking my map, and making sure I had enough food and water. But even as I moved around, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched, as though something outside the window was following me with unseen eyes. I told myself it was just paranoia. The forest was empty. People rarely came this far up, and most wildlife would have retreated at sunset. Still, every creak of a branch, every sudden rustle of leaves made my heart jump. Night came fully, and with it the dark that was almost complete. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the only light came from the stove and a small lantern I had set on the table. I tried to read, but my eyes kept wandering to the window. Shadows stretched across the clearing, twisting and moving as if alive. The hairs on my arms stood on end. I could hear distant sounds that were hard to identify. Branches snapping, leaves brushing against each other. The low groan of the trees as the wind shifted. I tried to rationalize each sound, telling myself it was deer, or raccoons, or the wind, but deep down, I could not convince myself entirely. Sometime around midnight, I was woken by a sound I could not immediately identify. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, a soft crunching outside the cabin. I froze, holding my breath, straining to hear. Then it came again, closer this time, deliberate. Footsteps, heavy, slow, measured. I had not expected anyone to be out here. The nearest road was miles away, and the last vehicle I had seen had long since disappeared down the winding gravel path. My mind raced. Could it be a hunter? An intruder? I considered making a run for my car, but the sound had stopped, replaced by something worse. Silence that was somehow heavier, more oppressive, pressing against the cabin walls like it wanted to suffocate me. I lay in bed, my blanket pulled tightly around me, listening to my own heartbeat. Every shadow outside the window seemed to shift and stretch toward me. I thought about calling someone, but there was no signal. I thought about leaving, but stepping outside in the dark with whoever or whatever was out there seemed like a terrible idea. I sat there for hours, awake, tense, listening to the forest, until the first hint of dawn lightened the sky. Morning was no relief. The forest seemed different in daylight. Colors were muted, everything covered in a gray haze. The clearing was empty, but I could see footprints in the mud. They were large, human-shaped, and they led from the edge of the forest toward the cabin. My stomach turned. Someone had been here last night, watching me, possibly waiting. I felt a mix of panic and determination. I needed to leave, but I had left my car keys inside the cabin. I could not risk going outside again. I decided to stay inside until I had a plan, trying to calm myself with tea and a careful inspection of the cabin. By midday, I had made a rough plan. I would pack up my things quietly, wait for the sun to be higher, and then sprint to my car. I gathered my backpack, moving as silently as possible, imagining every step and every sound. My heart pounded, and I checked the window constantly, expecting to see a shadow or a movement. There was nothing, but the sense of being watched never left. When I finally stepped outside, the forest felt oppressive. I kept my eyes on the clearing, on the trees where shadows clung. I could hear birds beginning to stir, but they sounded uneasy, as if they knew something I did not. I moved quickly, keeping my body low, my ears straining for any sound that indicated someone was nearby. I reached the car without incident, but as I fumbled with the keys, I realized I had left my backpack inside. The thought of going back made my stomach twist, but I knew I could not leave my supplies behind. I took a deep breath and sprinted back to the cabin. Each step was a risk. Branches cracked beneath my feet. My heart was in my throat. I reached the door, flung it open, grabbed my backpack, and nearly dropped it in my rush to leave. As I ran back to the car, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Footprints not far from the cabin, fresh, large, and moving toward me, not away. Someone had been watching me this morning. Someone had been planning. My pace increased. I dove into the car, slammed the door, and started the engine. Tires spun in the gravel as I tried to get traction, and I could feel the panic rising like a wave ready to drown me. The drive down the mountain was tense and agonizingly slow. Every turn and shadow made me flinch. I constantly checked the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a figure standing in the trees, watching me. The car rattled and groaned on the narrow road, and I had to fight the urge to slam my foot on the accelerator and risk rolling over. After what felt like hours, I finally reached the main road. It was a strange relief to see a few vehicles, people, signs of civilization. I pulled into a gas station, hands shaking, and finally allowed myself to breathe. I told myself I would never return to that cabin, that I would never go somewhere so isolated again. When I look back on that night, I realized the fear was not just the footsteps outside the cabin or the footprints in the mud. It was the knowledge that someone could be so close without being seen, that they could watch, plan, and wait for me without my knowing. The forest was no longer a peaceful escape. It had become a place of danger, a place where silence was threatening, and where the simple act of being alone could become a nightmare. I learned something crucial. Isolation amplifies fear, and even the smallest sound can become a signal of real danger. I stayed awake all night, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. The fear was exhausting, gnawing at me physically and mentally. I realized that I was trapped, completely isolated. No one could hear me if I screamed. The nearest road was miles away, the nearest town even farther. I could not run, and not without leaving myself vulnerable in the dark forest. The fear was oppressive, the kind that sits in your stomach and won't let you breathe. Morning came slowly. The light grew, washing the forest in pale gray. I was exhausted, nearly unable to move, but I had survived the night. I went to the window and looked outside. There were footprints around the cabin, heavy, human-sized, circling the cabin and disappearing into the woods. There were no other signs of life, no animals, nothing else to explain it. Someone had been there, someone had been moving around the cabin, close enough to touch the walls, and they had been watching me. I realized then that I needed a plan. I packed quickly, gathering my things, trying to make as little noise as possible. I left the cabin as it was, but I kept a mental note of where the footprints went. They led to a faint path into the woods. I didn't follow them, not yet. I got into my car and started it, the engine's roar feeling like a shield. I drove slowly down the dirt road, constantly scanning the trees, expecting to see someone watching me. I saw nothing, but I could feel it, eyes following me, somewhere in the distance. I drove for hours, reaching the main road and finally seeing other cars, other people. Relief washed over me, but it was muted. I could still feel the tension, the echo of the fear from the cabin. I called the local authorities and reported the incident. They said they would check the area, but I knew the person would have long gone by the time anyone arrived. I had the strange, unsettling certainty that someone had been living near that cabin, maybe watching travelers, maybe choosing targets carefully. The thought made my stomach churn. After that experience, I never returned to that cabin. I researched the area later, learning that it had a history of occasional break-ins and hikers being watched or followed. People had assumed it was wild animals, but some details never added up. Footprints too human, patterns too deliberate. I kept the story to myself for a long time, afraid people would think I had imagined it. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew the fear I had felt. It changed the way I looked at the woods. I had always loved isolation, the idea of being alone, but now I understood how dangerous it could be. Peace and quiet could hide threats, and the forest was not just serene. It could be calculated, patient, and silently cruel. Months later, I returned to that forest for closure, but I stayed on the main trails, never near the cabin. I left behind any thought of exploring alone in such remote areas. I still think about the footprints, the scratching on the door, the hours I spent awake, listening. But I also learned something crucial. Preparation is not just about food, tools, or maps. It's about awareness, caution, and understanding that isolation can turn even a place of beauty into a place of danger. And that night, in that cabin, I learned to respect it above all else. The memory lingers sometimes when I'm alone, even in a city. The sound of a branch snapping outside my window, the creak of a floorboard. My body reacts instantly, heart racing. It taught me fear, but it also taught me survival. And most importantly, it taught me to never underestimate the quiet, to never trust that a place is safe just because it feels peaceful. Because danger can hide anywhere, even in the most beautiful places, waiting patiently for someone who thinks they are alone. That evening, I heard something different. Deliberate, slow footsteps circling the cabin. They weren't faint or far away. They were deliberate, paced, methodical. I didn't see anyone, but I could hear them. My heart pounded, sweat ran down my back, and I could barely control my shaking. I stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, moving around the cabin. I realized that whoever it was, they had been here long enough to understand the layout. The cabin's isolation, once a charm, now felt like a trap. I decided I had to act before nightfall. I waited until the footsteps faded into the distance, then slipped out quietly through a back door, keeping low and moving carefully. I didn't want to see them, I didn't want to confront them. I followed the trail I had memorized toward the main road, keeping my backpack tight against me and the axe hidden. The forest seemed endless, the mist thickening as the evening approached. At one point, I stumbled over a root and nearly fell, my heart stopping. Every snap of a branch made me freeze. I thought I heard someone behind me, but when I turned, no one was there. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint line of the dirt road ahead. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. I kept moving until I reached a bend where I could see the main road in the distance. A car passed, headlights cutting through the forest, and I waved my arms desperately. The car stopped, and the driver looked at me with concern. I ran toward it, collapsing into the open door. The driver, without asking questions, drove me to the nearest town. I was shaking, soaked, and exhausted, but I was safe. The police came to check the cabin the next day after I reported what had happened. When they arrived, they found signs of someone living in the forest nearby. A small camp hidden in thick undergrowth, with makeshift bedding, fire remnants, and discarded food. It looked like the person had been observing the cabin for weeks, possibly months. They hadn't taken anything, and there was no sign of weapons, but the intent had been there. The isolation of the cabin had made it the perfect target. I never returned, and the memory of those footsteps, the rustle of leaves, and the oppressive silence of the forest stayed with me for years. I learned that sometimes the most terrifying experiences aren't about ghosts or legends. They're about real people, real danger, and the quiet that hides it. That cabin trip, meant to be an escape, became a lesson in vigilance, in reading the world around you, and in understanding that isolation can turn charm into threat in a heartbeat. I never underestimate the signs again, never assume silence equals safety, and I've learned to trust my instincts more than any plan or preparation. Even now, years later, when I see a dense forest or an isolated cabin, I feel the old tension in my chest. I remember the damp smell of the woods, the chill of the mist, the deliberate footsteps circling the cabin, and the stark realization that I was completely alone, and that wasn't always safe. I survived because I acted, because I noticed the details, because I didn't let fear freeze me entirely. And that, more than anything, is what I carry with me from that terrifying week. A respect for isolation, a vigilance for danger, and the knowledge that sometimes reality is scarier than any story. I had always liked cabins, the way they sat alone among the trees, far from towns and people, quietly surrounded by the forest. There was something about the stillness that felt peaceful, almost comforting, like the world had pressed pause. I had planned the trip carefully, months in advance, mapping the route, checking the weather, and packing everything I could possibly need. I liked being prepared. The cabin was in a remote area, tucked into a dense stretch of woods that no one passed through much. It had no cell service and only a small generator for electricity. I liked that too, the idea of being completely disconnected. It was going to be just me, nature, and the silence. Or so I thought. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet, the kind of drive where the miles felt heavier because the trees on either side of the road seemed to press in like they were watching. When I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, I had to slow down. It was rough, uneven, full of ruts and loose stones that jostled the car with every turn. I could see the roof of the cabin peeking through the trees in the distance, the wooden walls blending into the brown and green of the forest. Pulling up to the small clearing in front of the cabin, I parked and got out, stretching and taking a deep breath. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. It was quiet, so quiet that even the sound of my own breathing felt loud. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined. A small, single-story structure with a stone chimney and wooden walls that had weathered years of rain and sun. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and the door opened with a slight push. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint trace of dust. The place was simple but sturdy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a bathroom. I dropped my bag and walked through each room, taking in the details. The wooden beams overhead, the rough stone hearth, the worn floors, the small windows that framed the forest outside like pictures. I unpacked my things carefully, placing them in the small closets and on the shelves. Then I checked the generator and made sure it had fuel. I unpacked food and water, stacked firewood near the fireplace, and set out a few tools in case of emergencies. Every detail mattered because I didn't want to be caught unprepared. After everything was set, I sat in the living area, looking out the window at the forest. It was still and quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird far off in the distance. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the trees and the cabin clearing. As the light faded, I lit the fireplace and sat close to it, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. It was peaceful. The quiet was soothing, almost hypnotic. I felt completely alone, but I liked that. Being alone was part of why I had come. I made some tea, placed it on the small wooden table, and let the day slip away. Outside, the forest darkened, the shapes of the trees becoming dense black silhouettes. The sounds of nocturnal animals began to stir. An owl in the distance, a rustle of something small in the underbrush, but it felt natural, normal. I went to bed early that night. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fireplace that had burned low. I was tired from the drive and the unpacking, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The sleep was heavy, deep, the kind that feels endless until a sound wakes you sharply. I woke to a noise, soft but distinct, like someone moving outside. My first thought was the wind or an animal. The cabin sat alone in the forest, and small animals often wandered close. I lay still, straining to hear. There it was again, a soft, deliberate scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze, heart starting to race. I had double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed. The sound was faint, but it was coming closer. I realized that the noise wasn't random. It followed a pattern, a rhythm that suggested someone or something moving with intent. I stayed still, listening, my mind racing. Could it be an animal? A bear or a deer, maybe dragging a branch or stumbling through the undergrowth? The sound came again, closer this time, and then something shifted outside. A shadow passed across the thin curtains of the window. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it was probably nothing, a deer or a raccoon. But the shadow had been unmistakable, moving with a kind of awareness that animals didn't have. I sat up slowly, pulling a flashlight from the table. I switched it on and shone it through the window, scanning the clearing. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the ground, the trees, and the underbrush. Nothing moved. I felt my heart pounding, my chest tight. I grabbed my phone to check for signal. Maybe I could call someone just in case. But, as expected, there was none. I was completely cut off. I went to the door and checked the locks again. They were fine, sturdy, nothing loose. I decided to stay awake until sunrise, keeping the flashlight and a small hunting knife with me, just in case. The hours stretched endlessly. Every small sound made me jump. The snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the porch. The wind picked up and rattled the cabin walls. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that the forest was full of life and sound. But there was something about the noises outside that felt deliberate, calculated. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin at times, soft and careful, avoiding the crunch of the gravel. And then there was the scratching at the door, light but repeated, like someone testing it. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. Escape the city for a while, be alone in the woods, breathe fresh air, and enjoy the quiet. A small cabin I had found listed online seemed perfect. It was isolated, far from any town, and had basic amenities. It wasn't luxurious, but that was the point. I wanted solitude, not comfort. I packed the essentials: food, water, clothes, first aid kit, some books, and my camera. The drive took longer than expected, as I had to take a winding dirt road that cut through dense forest for miles. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long shadows through the tall pine trees, and the air smelled of wet earth and fallen leaves. The cabin itself was small, wooden, and weathered. It had a tin roof and a stone chimney. The door creaked when I opened it, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Inside, it was simple. A small kitchen area with a wood stove, a table with a couple of chairs, a single bed in the corner, and a bathroom with a functional, though old, toilet. Dust covered the surfaces, and a thin layer of cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling. I felt a small thrill of excitement and nervousness at being completely alone. I unpacked slowly, taking my time to make the space feel like mine. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. No distant hum of traffic, no neighbors arguing, no sirens. Just the wind through the trees and the occasional rustle of wildlife. I sat on the porch, staring into the forest, watching shadows move in the fading light. Owls called somewhere in the distance, and the darkness thickened rapidly. When I finally went to bed, I felt oddly exposed. The walls were thin, the floorboards hollow, and I could hear every creak of the cabin settling. Every snap of a branch outside made me tense. I eventually drifted to sleep, though lightly, my ears straining for sounds. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain tapping against the roof. I made coffee on the wood stove and ate a simple breakfast while looking out the window. The rain had a way of making the forest feel alive. Every leaf glistened, every branch dripped, and the fog that had started to roll in created a ghostly mist among the trees. I decided to explore a little, so I put on my boots and raincoat and walked along a narrow path I had noticed from the cabin. The mud squelched underfoot, and water dripped from the thick branches above. The forest was dense, and after a short while, I realized I could barely see the cabin. The isolation that had seemed charming now felt intimidating. Every step I took made me aware of how alone I was. I walked for a couple of hours, documenting plants and small animals with my camera. The forest was peaceful but strangely oppressive. By midday, I returned to the cabin, soaked and muddy, and started a fire to dry my clothes. That's when I noticed the first real problem. One of the logs I had stacked outside had been moved. I thought perhaps the wind had knocked it, but the placement didn't make sense. I shrugged it off as nothing and focused on getting warm. But over the next hour, I started noticing more signs. Footprints in the mud near the cabin that didn't match mine. Small branches broken in ways that suggested someone had walked through the woods nearby. I tried to rationalize it, deer, raccoons, but the footprints were too large, too flat, too deliberate to be animals. My stomach tightened. I stayed inside the rest of the day, keeping a close watch out the windows. The rain continued, and the mist grew thicker, obscuring everything beyond the small clearing the cabin sat in. By evening, I felt a persistent unease. I checked the locks on the doors, stacked chairs against them, and even moved a heavy dresser in front of the door. Every little sound, branches snapping, the wind rattling the roof, animals scurrying, made my heart jump. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined someone standing just outside the window, watching me. The next morning, the mist hadn't lifted. I tried to convince myself it was still just the woods, that no one could be out here, but my instincts screamed otherwise. I went outside to clear some of the mud around the cabin and reinforce the firewood stack. That's when I saw it clearly. Fresh footprints leading up to the cabin and back into the trees. They were large, boot-shaped, and unmistakably human. I froze. The forest, which had seemed peaceful, suddenly felt like it had turned against me. My mind raced with scenarios. Someone camping nearby, someone lost, someone malicious. I decided I couldn't stay passive. I grabbed a large knife from the kitchen and a metal flashlight. I stayed close to the cabin, moving carefully, scanning the mist for any sign of movement. Hours passed and I didn't see anything, though I constantly heard sounds. The crunch of leaves, faint whispers of movement, the snap of distant branches. My nerves were fraying, and the isolation magnified every sound. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting in the corner of the cabin with the knife on my lap, flashlight in hand. I barely dared breathe. On the third day, the rain stopped, leaving the forest damp and heavy. I knew I couldn't survive here indefinitely if someone was nearby. I considered leaving, but the dirt road I had used to arrive was narrow and winding, and I didn't want to encounter anyone on it. I decided to prepare an escape plan. I packed supplies into my backpack, filled water bottles, and mapped the trail back to the main road. I also made makeshift weapons, an old axe from the shed and a few metal rods. Every sound now set me on edge. Birds flying away in alarm, squirrels rustling in the underbrush, even the wind rattling the trees. All felt like warnings. I had always liked cabins, the way they sat alone among the trees, far from towns and people, quietly surrounded by the forest. There was something about the stillness that felt peaceful, almost comforting, like the world had pressed pause. I had planned the trip carefully, months in advance, mapping the route, checking the weather, and packing everything I could possibly need. I liked being prepared. The cabin was in a remote area, tucked into a dense stretch of woods that no one passed through much. It had no cell service and only a small generator for electricity. I liked that too, the idea of being completely disconnected. It was going to be just me, nature, and the silence. Or so I thought. The drive to the cabin was long and quiet, the kind of drive where the miles felt heavier because the trees on either side of the road seemed to press in like they were watching. When I finally reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, I had to slow down. It was rough, uneven, full of ruts and loose stones that jostled the car with every turn. I could see the roof of the cabin peeking through the trees in the distance, the wooden walls blending into the brown and green of the forest. Pulling up to the small clearing in front of the cabin, I parked and got out, stretching and taking a deep breath. The air smelled of wet earth and pine. It was quiet, so quiet that even the sound of my own breathing felt loud. The cabin was exactly what I had imagined. A small, single-story structure with a stone chimney and wooden walls that had weathered years of rain and sun. The porch creaked under my weight as I stepped onto it, and the door opened with a slight push. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and a faint trace of dust. The place was simple but sturdy, with a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, a bedroom, and a bathroom. I dropped my bag and walked through each room, taking in the details. The wooden beams overhead, the rough stone hearth, the worn floors, the small windows that framed the forest outside like pictures. I unpacked my things carefully, placing them in the small closets and on the shelves. Then I checked the generator and made sure it had fuel. I unpacked food and water, stacked firewood near the fireplace, and set out a few tools in case of emergencies. Every detail mattered because I didn't want to be caught unprepared. After everything was set, I sat in the living area, looking out the window at the forest. It was still and quiet, just the occasional rustle of leaves or a bird far off in the distance. The sun was low, casting long shadows that stretched across the trees and the cabin clearing. As the light faded, I lit the fireplace and sat close to it, feeling the warmth spread through the cabin. It was peaceful. The quiet was soothing, almost hypnotic. I felt completely alone, but I liked that. Being alone was part of why I had come. I made some tea, placed it on the small wooden table, and let the day slip away. Outside, the forest darkened, the shapes of the trees becoming dense black silhouettes. The sounds of nocturnal animals began to stir. An owl in the distance, a rustle of something small in the underbrush, but it felt natural, normal. I went to bed early that night. The cabin was dark except for the faint glow of the fireplace that had burned low. I was tired from the drive and the unpacking, and I fell asleep almost immediately. The sleep was heavy, deep, the kind that feels endless until a sound wakes you sharply. I woke to a noise, soft but distinct, like someone moving outside. My first thought was the wind or an animal. The cabin sat alone in the forest, and small animals often wandered close. I lay still, straining to hear. There it was again. A soft, deliberate scraping sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze, heart starting to race. I had double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before going to bed. The sound was faint, but it was coming closer. I realized that the noise wasn't random. It followed a pattern, a rhythm that suggested someone or something moving with intent. I stayed still, listening, my mind racing. Could it be an animal? A bear or a deer, maybe dragging a branch or stumbling through the undergrowth? The sound came again, closer this time, and then something shifted outside. A shadow passed across the thin curtains of the window. I swallowed hard and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself it was probably nothing, a deer or a raccoon. But the shadow had been unmistakable, moving with a kind of awareness that animals didn't have. I sat up slowly, pulling a flashlight from the table. I switched it on and shone it through the window, scanning the clearing. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the ground, the trees, and the underbrush. Nothing moved. I felt my heart pounding, my chest tight. I grabbed my phone to check for signal. Maybe I could call someone just in case. But, as expected, there was none. I was completely cut off. I went to the door and checked the locks again. They were fine, sturdy, nothing loose. I decided to stay awake until sunrise, keeping the flashlight and a small hunting knife with me, just in case. The hours stretched endlessly. Every small sound made me jump. The snapping of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the creak of the porch. The wind picked up and rattled the cabin walls. I tried to convince myself it was normal, that the forest was full of life and sound. But there was something about the noises outside that felt deliberate, calculated. I could hear footsteps circling the cabin at times, soft and careful, avoiding the crunch of the gravel. And then there was the scratching at the door, light but repeated, like someone testing it. I had always wanted to get away from the city for a while. The noise, the traffic, the endless pressure of work. It was suffocating. I needed a break, something quiet and remote, where I could be alone for a few days and just breathe. I found a cabin listed online, tucked deep in the mountains, far away from any small towns or major roads. The pictures made it look simple but sturdy, surrounded by dense pine trees and a small creek nearby. I didn't know who had stayed there before or what the cabin's history was, but that didn't matter. I just wanted isolation and silence, and that was exactly what it promised. I packed my car with basic supplies: food, water, blankets, a small first aid kit, some canned goods, a few bags of rice and beans, a stove, and extra firewood. I also brought my flashlight, batteries, and a few basic tools, just in case. I left my phone on airplane mode the entire trip, wanting nothing to do with work or the outside world. The drive was long, winding through mountain roads that got narrower as I climbed higher. By the time I reached the last stretch, the sun was low, and the forest was dense and shadowed, the trees stretching up like dark fingers against the sky. The gravel road leading to the cabin was rough, but my car handled it without much trouble. When I finally saw the cabin, a low wooden structure with a small porch and a single chimney, I felt relief. It was more remote than I had imagined, completely hidden among the trees, and I knew I wouldn't see another person for miles. The cabin itself was simple as promised. Inside, there was a small living space with a table and chairs, a wood stove in the corner, a loft with a single mattress, and shelves stocked with some basic supplies left behind by whoever owned the place. There was a small bathroom with a cold water tap, and I could hear the creek running just outside. I unpacked slowly, arranging my food and blankets, lighting the stove to take the chill off the air, and listening to the forest around me. The wind moved the trees, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the occasional crack of a branch. At first, it was comforting, the sound of nature surrounding me. But as night fell, that comfort started to shift. The darkness came quickly in the mountains. I had brought candles and lanterns, but I also kept my flashlight close. When the sun went down completely, I felt the first real sense of unease. The forest seemed to close in around the cabin, the shadows deep and shifting. I went to sleep in the loft, the thin mattress creaking under me, but I kept one eye open. Every noise, the wind rattling the roof, the distant crash of water, a bird moving through the trees, felt amplified. I told myself it was normal, just the sounds of a forest at night, but the awareness that I was alone made it feel different, sharper. The next morning, I woke early, hearing the creek outside. I made coffee on the stove and sat at the table, watching the morning light filter through the trees. Everything seemed calm, peaceful even, but there was a tension I couldn't shake. As I stepped outside, I noticed something I hadn't the night before. The ground around the cabin was uneven, with deep footprints leading up from the road and around the back. They looked old, at least a day or two, but the size and spacing made me uneasy. Someone had been here recently. I felt a twinge of fear, but I rationalized it. Maybe it was just a hiker, someone who had walked through the woods. I was in a remote area, after all. People did come through occasionally, even if rarely. I spent the morning exploring around the cabin, walking along the creek, checking the trees for any signs of wildlife, anything unusual. The forest was quiet, too quiet at times, but I reminded myself that it was normal for wildlife to be cautious around humans. Around midday, I returned to the cabin to prepare lunch. As I stepped inside, I felt the first real sense that I wasn't alone. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A faint smell in the air, like smoke or damp clothing. I checked the stove. It hadn't been used in days, and everything inside was as I left it. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was overthinking. That afternoon, I decided to gather more firewood. I grabbed an axe and headed into the trees, a few meters from the cabin. The forest floor was thick with pine needles, soft but uneven. I walked carefully, scanning for fallen branches suitable for the stove. As I chopped wood, I kept hearing the sound of footsteps behind me, soft, deliberate. I froze several times, convinced someone was there, but each time I turned, there was nothing. Just the trees, the creek in the distance, and the occasional bird. My heart raced, and I realized I hadn't heard any bird calls for the past few minutes. There was a silence that felt unnatural, heavy, like the forest itself was holding its breath. I finished gathering the wood faster than I intended and returned to the cabin. Once inside, I locked the door, bolted it as best I could, and stacked the wood near the stove. I started to notice small things. Marks on the floorboards that hadn't been there before, the faint sound of scraping on the back wall. My anxiety built slowly but steadily. I reminded myself I was alone, that there was no one else here, yet the evidence suggested otherwise. I started to consider the possibility that someone had entered the cabin while I was outside. The thought was terrifying. I checked my small first aid kit, made sure my flashlight had fresh batteries, and even kept a kitchen knife close. I didn't want to panic, but I knew I needed to prepare. Night came again, and with it, a deeper sense of isolation. I lit the stove and a few lanterns, keeping the room bright and warm. I couldn't sit still. Every noise outside, the wind, the trees, the creek, felt amplified, as though someone were moving through it deliberately. I stayed awake most of the night, flashlight in hand, checking every corner of the cabin. At one point, I heard the sound of something heavy moving against the outer walls, like someone leaning on the cabin or walking just outside. I froze, holding my breath, waiting for a clear sign. Eventually, the sound stopped, and I dared not sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I decided I couldn't stay passive. I needed to figure out if someone was nearby and whether I was in danger. I planned to hike toward the nearest road, which was several kilometers away, to check on the area and perhaps signal for help. I packed my bag with essentials, extra water, and the knife just in case. As I stepped outside, I noticed the footprints again, fresh this time, heading toward the cabin. They were large, heavy, and deliberate. I felt a cold wave of fear. Whoever had been here was still nearby. My mind raced through scenarios, all of them frightening. I had no phone signal, no neighbors, and no way to call for immediate help. I considered running, but the dense forest made that dangerous. I had to be cautious. I moved slowly, watching the trees, scanning the forest floor for any movement. Every snapping branch made me jump. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally. I realized I had to think strategically. I picked a route that would allow me to see farther ahead, staying near the creek where I could hear water moving, masking my footsteps somewhat. As I walked, I noticed signs of a person. Broken branches, footprints, and even small caches of food someone had left in the undergrowth. They were organized, deliberate, and close enough to suggest that whoever it was had been observing the cabin, maybe even me. Panic threatened to take over, but I forced myself to focus. I couldn't afford to run blindly. I needed to reach the road and find a safe place. Hours passed. The terrain was rough, and the forest seemed endless. I kept to the shadows of trees, moving quietly, but I occasionally saw fleeting glimpses of someone or something through the foliage. My mind played tricks on me, but I knew the danger was real. I felt exhaustion in my legs. My arms ached from holding the knife ready, and my throat was dry. By late afternoon, I finally reached a ridge that overlooked the road. It was a small dirt path, barely visible from above, and it gave me hope. I stayed hidden for a moment, observing. There was a vehicle parked several hundred meters down, and I saw a person walking nearby, talking into a phone. Relief washed over me. I had made it to a place where someone else existed, someone who could help. I waited until the person returned to the car, then I moved carefully toward the road. I kept low, using trees for cover. When I finally reached the dirt path, I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline pushing me forward. I reached the car and saw the driver, a middle-aged man, who looked confused but concerned when I waved frantically. I explained quickly, pointing toward the forest, and he nodded, calling the police immediately. Within an hour, officers arrived, combing the area around the cabin. They found evidence of someone living near the cabin recently, makeshift shelters, food caches, and footprints, but no one was there at the moment. It seemed the person had fled when they realized I had left. The officers told me it wasn't uncommon in remote areas. Squatters, people hiding in the woods, sometimes dangerous, sometimes just desperate. But they took my statements seriously and warned me never to return alone. I never went back to that cabin. The experience left a mark on me, a mixture of fear and a deep awareness of how quickly isolation can become dangerous. I realized that being alone in the woods isn't always peaceful. It can be frightening, unpredictable, and perilous. But I also learned to respect the wilderness, to prepare properly, and to trust my instincts. That cabin, hidden deep in the mountains, would always stay in my memory, not as a peaceful retreat, but as a reminder of how quickly things can change when you think you are alone, and how crucial it is to stay alert, cautious, and prepared when you are. Over time, I told myself I had learned a valuable lesson. The forest is beautiful, but it is also home to people and situations you don't see coming. I made sure, in any future trips, to check in, leave notices of where I would be, and never underestimate the risk. The fear I felt that week stayed with me, but it also made me stronger, more aware, and more careful. I realized that survival isn't about avoiding fear. It's about facing it, understanding it, and taking the right steps to protect yourself. That week in the cabin taught me that lesson in the most raw, real, and frightening way possible. I had been looking forward to the trip for months. After months of constant work stress, sleepless nights, and the relentless hum of the city, I wanted nothing more than solitude, silence, and the simplicity of a cabin in the woods. The cabin I rented was located several miles off the main road, deep into a stretch of pine and fir that locals referred to as the Timber Hollow. It was an old structure, wooden with a steep roof, a small porch, and a stone chimney that had been long unused. The photos online made it look cozy and inviting, and the idea of complete isolation appealed to me immensely. I packed my car carefully, triple-checking that I had all my essentials: food, water, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a fully charged power bank, firewood, blankets, and extra batteries. I even brought a small camping stove, though the cabin had a rudimentary kitchen. My plan was simple: arrive before nightfall, unpack, make a fire, and let the silence of the forest wash over me. The drive-in was long, winding through narrow dirt roads that twisted around thick clusters of trees. The sun was starting to dip behind the horizon as I left the last sign of civilization behind. There were no streetlights, no other cars, just the low hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. I could feel the tension in my shoulders slowly ease, replaced by a quiet, anticipatory excitement. I reached the cabin just as darkness began to settle in, the sky turning a deep shade of blue that soon gave way to black. The first thing I noticed was how still it was. Not a single bird, no distant traffic, no other humans. Even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing through the trees almost silently. I parked near the cabin, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. The front door was unlocked, just as the rental instructions had said. The inside smelled faintly of old wood, pine, and a hint of mold, which was expected given the location and age of the cabin. I unpacked quickly, placing my bags on the floor, and decided to start a fire to get some warmth and light. I stacked the firewood carefully in the small fireplace and managed to get a flame going after a few attempts. The fire caught quickly, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and the heat was instantly comforting. I pulled out a book I had brought, A Quiet Companion, and settled into a chair near the fireplace, sipping from a bottle of water. Outside, the night was completely dark. I could see nothing beyond the small circle of light the cabin provided. I thought about how few people came this far, and for the first time I truly felt alone. Around midnight, I started to hear it. At first, it was subtle. A light thud against the side of the cabin, almost like a branch falling or an animal brushing against the wall. I froze, straining my ears, listening. Another thud came, slightly louder, then a scraping sound, faint but unmistakable, like nails or claws dragging across wood. I told myself it was a raccoon or maybe a deer. There were plenty of animals in these woods. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept flicking toward the window, peering into the black. The sounds grew closer, and I realized they weren't random. There was a rhythm to them, slow and deliberate, almost as if someone or something was circling the cabin. My heart rate picked up, and I put down the book, moving quietly to the door. The wind had shifted, and I could hear the trees moving more violently, making the cabin creak in protest. I wanted to tell myself it was nothing, but instinct told me to be alert. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly approached the door, trying not to make any noise. Outside, the beam of the light cut through the darkness, illuminating the ground, the trees, and the thick undergrowth. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, in the corner of my vision, I saw a shadow dart past the side of the cabin. My stomach dropped. It was fast, too fast for a deer. It didn't run away, it didn't jump, just moved with deliberate speed from one side to the other. I backed away from the door, feeling trapped. The isolation that had once been comforting now felt suffocating. I tried to make sense of it, scanning the trees, the underbrush, anything. My mind raced with possibilities. I considered leaving immediately, driving back to the nearest town, but I realized that my car was parked on an uneven path several hundred meters away, and moving in the dark could be dangerous. I needed to secure myself inside. I locked the doors and checked the windows. All were latched, though I noticed the lock on the back door was old and somewhat brittle. I put a chair under it for extra security. Then I went back to the fireplace, trying to make the cabin feel safer. I told myself that what I saw was probably just an animal, maybe a deer that had been startled. I tried to calm down, telling myself that the odds of someone following me here, or that an actual person was outside circling my cabin, were astronomically low. Still, every rustle, every branch snapping made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again. A distinct knock on the window by the kitchen. Slow, deliberate, soft but precise. My throat tightened. I approached it cautiously, shining the flashlight. Nothing. Just the reflection of the fire in the glass, the black beyond. The thought that someone could be outside, watching me, made my skin crawl. I backed away, trying to rationalize. Maybe it was an animal that had learned to tap on the glass to see inside? Impossible, but my mind was grasping at anything. I sat in the living room for what felt like hours, fire crackling, listening. Each sound in the dark amplified tenfold. The wind through the trees, the occasional snap of a branch, the soft scuttling across the roof. At one point, I thought I saw a shape moving across the roof, just at the edge of my vision. Couldn't be sure. Every instinct told me to leave, but it was the middle of the night. I was exhausted, and I didn't know if I could navigate the woods in total darkness safely. By the time dawn started to break, I had barely slept, constantly jumping at every sound. The first light revealed nothing, no tracks, no footprints, nothing. Just the same dense trees, the familiar dirt path leading back to the main road. I forced myself to calm down, telling myself I had imagined most of it. After a quick breakfast, I decided to inspect the perimeter of the cabin in daylight. The area was overgrown with ferns and bushes, and I had to push branches aside as I walked around. That's when I noticed the footprints. Fresh, large, and human, circling the cabin in a rough, deliberate path. My stomach sank. They weren't deep, indicating a lightweight, maybe someone younger or smaller, but they were distinct. Whoever had been outside had been circling the cabin, moving carefully. There were no other signs of disturbance, no broken branches, nothing else out of place. I didn't see anyone, but I now knew I wasn't imagining it. I spent the rest of the day on high alert, keeping the doors locked, windows checked, and staying near the main living area. I kept a heavy iron poker close just in case. I tried to work, reading, writing notes, anything to keep my mind busy. But every little sound, the wind, a bird, a squirrel, made me tense. The sun began to dip again, and I realized I had to face another night of the same terrifying uncertainty. By nightfall, I had devised a plan. I would make a lot of noise to assert my presence, hoping to scare off whoever or whatever was outside. I kept the fire going, banged on the walls, moved furniture in the living room, anything to make it clear that I was not an easy target. The sounds outside immediately stopped. It was as if whoever had been circling the cabin had sensed my activity and retreated. The rest of the night passed in tense silence, but at least there were no knocks, no scuttling, no shadows darting past. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed quickly, leaving most of the supplies behind, and drove back to civilization. On the way out, I saw a small dirt road leading deeper into the woods, almost hidden by foliage. I could have sworn I glimpsed someone standing at the edge, watching me as I drove away. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Weeks later, I learned from a local ranger that Timber Hollow had a history of break-ins, some of them violent. The isolated cabins made perfect targets for thieves, and the dense forest made it easy to observe without being seen. Some locals speculated about people living off the grid in the area, using the woods as cover. That explained everything: the circling, the shadows, the knocks. I realized how close I had been to a dangerous encounter, and how easily things could have gone wrong if I had left a window unlocked or ventured outside at the wrong moment. The experience stayed with me for a long time. I still love the idea of solitude, but I now understand that being completely alone in a remote area carries risks that can't be ignored. The memory of those circling footsteps, the deliberate knocks, and the shadows moving just beyond my vision taught me a lesson about vigilance, preparation, and respect for the unknown dangers of the wilderness. I never returned to that cabin, and I never underestimated the quiet tension of the woods again. I kept a journal of that night, describing every sound, every movement, every fear. It became a record, not just of terror, but of survival, of my ability to stay calm under pressure, to make rational decisions even when my instincts screamed at me to run blindly into danger. Looking back, I realized that what made the experience terrifying was not any supernatural element, but the raw human threat, the knowledge that someone could have been outside, watching, waiting, and that at any moment my life could have been at risk. It was a test of awareness, and I passed, though barely. Years later, I share this story cautiously, warning others about the realities of isolation. Cabins in the woods are beautiful, but they can also be dangerous. The forest doesn't care about your plans, your comfort, or your desire for peace. The forest hides threats in silence, in shadows, in footsteps that are just beyond the edge of your perception. And sometimes, the scariest things are not imaginary. They are real, deliberate, and very close. I decided then that I needed to leave. I packed quickly, double-checked the cabin, and prepared to hike back to my car. But as I stepped outside, I saw more footprints, fresh and heading away from the cabin into the woods. Someone had been here while I slept. I took a deep breath and started walking, keeping my hatchet ready and moving quietly along the paths I had memorized. The forest felt different in daylight, less threatening but still tense. Every tree seemed like it could hide someone. I kept moving, never stopping, until I finally reached the dirt road that led back to the main path. When I saw my car, relief washed over me, but I didn't let my guard down. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine, scanning the forest as I drove away. The feeling of being hunted lingered, but at least I was moving towards safety. It took hours to reach the nearest town. The roads were winding, the mountains stretching endlessly on either side. When I finally found a gas station with a payphone, I called the authorities. I reported what had happened, explaining the footprints, the scratches, and the sightings. The officer on the phone sounded skeptical, but promised to send someone to check the area. I didn't wait around. I rented a motel room and stayed there for the night, finally able to sleep without fear of someone outside watching me. Over the next few days, I learned that others had reported similar incidents in the area. Strangers sneaking around cabins, watching, leaving traces, but rarely causing direct harm. It seemed like some people took pleasure in terrorizing those who came seeking solitude, and the remote location made it easy for them to act without consequence. In the end, I never returned to that cabin. I told myself I would find peace in nature again, but in safer, more populated areas. The experience had changed me. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, cautious of isolation, and respectful of the unknown dangers that could exist even in the most beautiful places. Looking back, I realized that what had made the cabin truly terrifying wasn't the darkness, the wind, or the forest. It was the presence of another human being, silent, patient, and unpredictable, who had used the wilderness as a hunting ground. The fear of what could have happened, the knowledge that someone had been so close without being caught, stayed with me long after I returned to the city. I learned to appreciate safety, to understand that solitude can carry risks, and that the wilderness, no matter how serene, can hold real, very human dangers. Even months later, I would find myself checking locks twice, scanning the trees when I walked near forests, remembering that night in the cabin and the tall figure that had watched me from the shadows. It was a terrifying memory, but one that left me alive, cautious, and deeply aware of the fragile line between safety and exposure in the wilderness. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. I wanted solitude, a break from the constant noise of the city, and a chance to immerse myself in nature. The cabin I rented was deep in the mountains, miles from the nearest town, perched beside a small, murky lake. The drive there had been long and twisting, the road narrow and lined with dense forest on both sides. I remember the moment I turned onto the final dirt path leading to the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of pine and wet earth, and the sun was beginning its slow descent behind the peaks. I parked my car and walked to the cabin, carrying a single backpack. The wooden structure was small, sturdy, and isolated, with windows clouded from years of dust. There was a sense of peace, almost a perfection in its isolation, but that peace carried a weight, a quiet that felt heavy in my chest. Inside, the cabin was basic but comfortable. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove, a worn wooden table, and a sofa that sagged in the middle. The fireplace had blackened stones and ashes from previous fires, and I found a stack of old logs near the wall. I unpacked slowly, laying out my clothes, my notebook, my camera, and the small emergency kit I had brought. I wanted to document my stay, but part of me also wanted to simply disappear into the silence. The first night, I made a small fire in the fireplace and cooked some pasta. The flames crackled and cast shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled the branches, and occasionally I could hear the distant calls of birds or the splash of water from the lake. It was quiet in a way that was almost unnatural. I went to bed early, feeling the comfort of a mattress and the deep stillness of the mountains around me. The next morning, I woke to the sound of rain. I pressed my forehead against the cold window, watching droplets streak down the glass. The forest was muted, the colors dull under the gray sky. I decided to explore the area despite the rain. I pulled on waterproof boots and my jacket, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, the kind that made your lungs feel clean but tight. The ground was slippery with mud, and I had to move carefully along the narrow paths that wound between trees and underbrush. I reached the edge of the lake. The water was dark and still, reflecting the sky like glass. The smell of wet earth was stronger here, mingled with decaying leaves. I noticed the footprints along the shore, animal tracks I thought at first. But then I realized some of them were human, large, booted prints that led around the lake and vanished into the trees. I froze for a moment, feeling a tight knot in my stomach. I convinced myself it was probably someone who had visited before me. The mountains had hikers, after all. But a part of me felt a growing unease, a sense that the forest was watching, that the quiet was hiding something. Over the next 2 days, I tried to maintain a routine. I chopped wood for the fireplace, walked along the trails, and kept a journal of my observations. But the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I would catch glimpses of movement at the edge of my vision. Shadows flitting between trees, shapes that vanished when I turned to look. At first, I thought it was deer or perhaps raccoons. But the more I saw, the more certain I became that it wasn't entirely animals. One evening, as the sun dipped below the mountains, I went down to the lake to photograph the sunset. The water was still, and the mist rose slowly from the surface. As I knelt to take a picture, I noticed something that made my heart race. Footprints had appeared overnight, fresh prints in the mud along the shore. They were large, heavy, and booted. They were moving parallel to the lake, heading toward the cabin. My stomach sank. I had locked the doors and windows in the morning. No one else was supposed to be here. I gathered my things and walked back to the cabin, trying to remain calm. I told myself it was probably a ranger or another hiker, but the feeling of being hunted had taken root deep inside me. That night, I stayed awake for hours, sitting by the fireplace, listening to the rain and the wind and the occasional snap of a branch outside. Every sound made my heart jump. I imagined someone moving silently among the trees, watching me, waiting. I checked the locks on the doors repeatedly. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps on gravel. My breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the window. The beam swept across the clearing in front of the cabin. There was nothing there, but then I saw movement in the shadows at the edge of the forest. A figure tall and still, watching. I froze. My first instinct was to call for help, but I realized my phone had no signal. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to think clearly. I needed to stay calm. I kept the flashlight trained on the dark tree-line and waited. The figure didn't move, didn't come closer. After what felt like an eternity, it disappeared into the shadows. I stayed awake until dawn, watching, listening, and planning what I would do next. The next morning, I discovered more signs. The cabin door had faint scratches along the bottom, and one of the windows had been nudged slightly. It was subtle but unmistakable. Someone had been outside during the night. My sense of isolation had turned into a tangible fear. I realized I couldn't just stay here passively. I spent the day reinforcing the cabin as best I could, wedging a chair against the door, moving furniture near windows, and sharpening the hatchet I had brought for chopping wood. I collected rocks and sticks, placing them near the windows as makeshift alarms. My hands shook constantly. Every sound, every bird call, every snap of a branch made me jump. I stayed alert, sleep-deprived, and tense. By the third night, the fear had reached a peak. I stayed in the corner of the cabin near the fireplace, my hatchet ready. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, this time moving carefully through the wet leaves. They circled the cabin, slow, deliberate, and heavy. I watched through the small gap in the curtains. The figure was real, tall, wearing dark clothing, moving in a calculated manner. My heart pounded. I thought about fighting, about hiding, about running. But running was impossible. I would have to cross open ground into the forest, and I had no idea what lay beyond. I stayed still, hoping to be invisible, hoping it would go away. Hours passed. I must have dozed briefly because when I opened my eyes, it was just before dawn. The figure was gone. The sun rose slowly, casting long shadows across the clearing. I felt exhausted, drained, and scared in a way I had never felt before. I had planned the trip for weeks. It was supposed to be a simple escape from the city, a chance to be alone with nature and clear my head. I rented a small cabin deep in the mountains, far from any main road, hidden among a dense stretch of pines and firs. The directions the owner had sent were vague, but I liked the idea of getting lost on purpose, finding my own path, and feeling the isolation that comes from being away from people, phones, and constant noise. I had packed carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. The idea of being fully self-reliant made me feel alive. The drive itself was longer than I expected. The roads twisted sharply, the mountain air was thin, and the trees seemed to close in around me as I climbed higher. The sun was setting when I finally reached the last turn before the cabin. The dirt track was rough, full of potholes and scattered rocks. I slowed down, gripping the steering wheel tightly. The headlights barely penetrated the dark shadows of the forest. A few times, I had to stop completely to navigate around fallen branches. I could feel my pulse quicken with every sudden noise, every creak of the car's tires on uneven ground. Finally, I saw it, the cabin. It was small, made of dark-stained logs that blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding trees. Smoke rose lazily from the chimney, though the sky was nearly dark. I parked and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air smelled of pine, damp earth, and cold. The silence hit me immediately, not just the absence of human voices, but the kind of silence where the wind seems to carry sound from miles away, where every snapping twig and rustle of leaves sounds amplified. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. It smelled faintly of wood polish and something older, like dust that had settled over years. The interior was simple. A small kitchen area with a stove, a wooden table, a few chairs, and a small bed in the corner. A fireplace sat against one wall, its hearth cold and empty. Windows on each side of the cabin framed the forest outside, dark shadows moving in the fading light. I set my backpack down and took a deep breath, letting myself sink into the quiet. I felt both relief and a slight unease. Being alone this far from anyone made me realize how fragile comfort really was. The first night passed with the kind of uneventful calm that lulls you into false security. I ate a simple dinner, read for a while, and tried to sleep. But even in sleep, the cabin made its presence known. The wooden walls creaked as the temperature dropped. Tiny animals scurried across the roof, their movements sharp and quick. Every time the wind blew through the trees, it created shadows that seemed almost alive. I kept telling myself it was all natural, normal. Still, I woke more than once to the feeling of being watched, a tension that settled in my chest and refused to leave. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The terrain was rougher than I expected. The trees were dense, the ground uneven with roots and fallen branches. The deeper I went, the more the sounds of civilization faded. I lost track of time, and when I looked at my watch, the sunlight had already begun to fade. I had wandered farther than I intended, and the cabin no longer seemed visible. My sense of direction was poor, and panic started to creep in. I tried to retrace my steps, but the forest seemed to shift subtly. Paths that seemed obvious now looked unfamiliar. Shadows were longer, the air colder. Every crackle in the underbrush made my heart jump. Eventually, I found a small stream and followed it, hoping it would lead me back. The sound of running water was comforting, rhythmic, like a guide through the wilderness. Still, I remained tense. Hours passed, the light fading quickly, and I realized I might be out here after dark. I hurried along the bank, knowing the path could become dangerous. Roots hidden under leaves, slippery stones. My mind began running through worst-case scenarios. Falling and breaking a leg, being stuck overnight, a wild animal encounter. Each thought made me more aware of my isolation. By the time I saw the faint outline of the cabin through the trees, night had fully fallen. I was soaked from a sudden, light drizzle, chilled to the bone, and exhausted. The forest felt alive in the darkness, every sound amplified, every shadow threatening. The cabin, once comforting, now appeared like a fragile shelter surrounded by endless unknown. I entered quickly, bolting the door behind me. My chest heaved as I tried to steady my breathing, telling myself I had made it back. But the fear lingered, crawling through my veins, refusing to leave. That night was different. I had never felt the cabin so small, so vulnerable. Every small sound, the wind scraping against the walls, the shift of a loose floorboard, a distant howl from the forest, kept me awake. I kept imagining someone outside, just beyond the windows, waiting. Rationally, I knew it was unlikely, but my body didn't care. The forest had taken on a new character. Hostile, watching, unpredictable. I stayed up all night, moving from room to room, checking the locks, peering through the windows, straining my ears for anything unusual. The next morning, I tried to rationalize my fear. I reminded myself that the forest was full of wildlife, that the cabin had a lock, and that no one else was likely around. But I couldn't shake the feeling that my isolation had become a liability. I made a plan. I would stay inside as much as possible, and when I did leave, I would make sure I was prepared. I packed a small day bag with water, food, a flashlight, and a first aid kit, even though I had brought more supplies. I decided to explore only along the edges of the property, keeping the cabin in sight. It was during one of these cautious explorations that I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the mud near the cabin. They weren't mine. At first, I thought they were animal tracks, but the spacing, the shape, the depth, they were human. My heart pounded. I followed them cautiously, trying to understand their origin. They led into the forest and stopped abruptly. There was no sign of who had left them. No clues, just the sudden absence of tracks. My mind raced. Could someone have been watching me? Was it a hunter, a hiker, or someone with malicious intent? The realization that I wasn't alone, not entirely, made the forest even more threatening. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept the door locked, my backpack ready beside me. Every sound made me tense, every shadow suspicious. I found myself peeking out the windows constantly, scanning the trees. Hours passed slowly. The rain began light at first, then heavier. I could hear the patter against the roof, the trees bending with the wind. The cabin, normally a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. I spent the night listening, waiting, imagining every possible scenario of someone approaching the cabin. The fear was real, physical, a weight pressing down on me. The following day, I realized I needed a plan. I couldn't stay in a state of constant anxiety, and I couldn't keep hiding. I decided to leave. I packed my things methodically, double-checked my supplies, and prepared the car. I waited for daylight, hoping that in the light, the forest would seem less threatening, and I could navigate the rough roads safely. I kept a small knife in my pocket and my flashlight in hand, just in case. When I stepped outside, the air was crisp, and the rain had slowed to a drizzle. The forest still seemed endless, but the daylight provided some comfort. I checked the car, started the engine, and drove slowly down the dirt track. Every shadow between the trees made me tense. Every sudden noise made me glance around. But eventually, after what felt like an eternity, I reached the main road. Civilization, signs of human life. Relief flooded through me in waves. Driving back, I reflected on the experience. The cabin had been beautiful, isolated, and serene, but it had also reminded me of how small and vulnerable one can feel when truly alone. Fear doesn't always come from supernatural forces. It comes from isolation, uncertainty, and the knowledge that your safety depends entirely on yourself. I realized how carefully we take safety for granted in daily life and how quickly that sense can vanish when you are alone in the wilderness. When I returned home, I unpacked slowly, making sure everything was in order. I showered, feeling the water wash away the tension that had settled in my muscles. I ate a meal and rested, finally allowing myself to relax. The cabin trip had been frightening, challenging, and eye-opening. It had tested my resilience, my decision-making, and my capacity to handle fear. And in the end, I had come out of it intact, wiser, and more aware of the fragility of comfort and security. Even now, months later, I think back to the cabin. I remember the creaking walls, the shifting shadows, the footprints in the mud. But I also remember my determination, the careful planning, and the relief of finding safety again. It taught me that fear is real, but so is preparation and clarity. I hadn't met ghosts or monsters. I had faced the very real wilderness, with its uncertainty, its unpredictability, and its cold, silent power. And I had survived. I had been planning the trip for months. It wasn't unusual for me to go out into the woods, alone, just to escape the noise of the city, the constant chatter, the unending demands of work and life. I needed silence. Not the kind you get in a hotel room with the air conditioner humming and traffic faintly vibrating under your door. I needed the kind of silence that pressed against your ears and made you feel like you were part of the world itself, the real, untouched world. That's why I chose this cabin. It was old, wooden, tucked away deep in the mountains, far from anything resembling a town. The road that led there had long ago stopped being a road in any official sense. It was a rough track through the forest, narrow enough that two cars couldn't pass, lined with trees that leaned over it like soldiers, holding their breath. The first few hours driving had been uneventful, at least for me. I had packed light. A few changes of clothes, food that could last without refrigeration, a small gas stove, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a book I had never read, and a bottle of water. My car had a full tank, and I double-checked the GPS, though I knew from reviews online that it could be unreliable up here. Still, the directions seemed simple enough, mostly just following the path of the river until it forked near the old bridge. The closer I got to the cabin, the narrower the path became. It was nothing more than a dirt trail, filled with potholes and covered in layers of fallen leaves. The smell of wet earth, moss, and pine was thick, almost tangible. The sun had begun to drop lower behind the mountains, turning the sky a soft pink that deepened to an orange glow. Shadows stretched longer across the path, and I realized that soon, I would be driving blind if I didn't reach the cabin before dark. I had seen the cabin in pictures, but nothing prepared me for its actual presence. It was smaller than I expected, a single-story structure with a porch that sagged slightly in the middle. The wood was weathered gray, but sturdy, and the windows were covered in a fine layer of dust. The door had a rusted latch and the lock was just as old, but it worked. I parked the car beside the cabin and climbed out, the air crisp and smelling of pine and wet soil. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. I didn't hear birds, or even the occasional rustle of small animals. There was only the whisper of the wind through the trees, and the faint sound of water moving somewhere in the distance. I took a deep breath and felt a strange kind of calm, the kind that comes before something changes, before reality shifts just enough to make you notice the edges of yourself. I opened the cabin door. It creaked, complaining after years of being unused, and stepped inside. The air was cooler than outside, damp with the smell of old wood and something else, something faintly sour that I couldn't immediately identify. Dust covered most surfaces, and cobwebs hung from corners like forgotten lace. The floorboards were uneven, some sagging slightly, and they groaned under my weight. I walked slowly, careful not to break anything, and began inspecting the place. There was a small kitchen area, just a counter, a sink, and a tiny gas stove. A couple of cabinets were still stocked with basic utensils, though they were tarnished and coated in dust. I opened the fridge. Well, an old metal box that might once have been a fridge, but it was empty and smelled sharply of rust and rot. The living area had a table, 2 chairs, and a small sofa that had faded to a grayish brown. I ran my hands along the back of the sofa, stirring a layer of dust into the air. The bedroom was just off the main room, a small space with a single bed frame, a mattress stained from who knows what, and a dresser. I didn't bother unpacking much. I just laid my bag on the bed, lit a small lantern I had brought, and started exploring outside. The property was small, just enough space for the cabin and a tiny clearing before the trees closed in again. Behind the cabin, the forest climbed steeply, and I could hear the sound of the stream more clearly now. I followed it a little ways, my boots sinking into mud that had accumulated from recent rain. The trees here were old and tall, and the forest floor was a tangle of roots, moss, and fallen branches. I noted that the ground was uneven, and any misstep could easily twist an ankle. After a short walk, I returned to the cabin and began preparing a simple meal. The evening fell quickly. Once the sun disappeared, the temperature dropped sharply. I lit the small gas stove, boiled water for coffee, and sat at the table eating from a small can of beans I had brought. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I could hear my own breathing and the creaks of the cabin settling under the weight of the night. Outside, the wind rustled leaves and branches, making shadows that danced along the walls. I kept checking the door, imagining, ridiculous as it was, that someone could suddenly appear, but there was nothing. Only the forest, only the cold creeping in from the corners of the cabin. I went to bed early, even though I wasn't tired. The mattress was thin and worn, the springs groaning every time I shifted. I lay there listening to the sounds outside, a mixture of wind, rustling leaves, and occasional cracking branches. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with half-dreams, half-waking moments where I imagined shadows moving just outside the window, shapes that could have been animals or something else. Around 2 in the morning, I woke with a start. The cabin had gone completely silent. The wind stopped, the forest still. I felt it before I saw it, a sense that I wasn't alone. My eyes adjusted to the dim light of the lantern I had left on the table. At first, I thought it was my imagination, a leftover echo of the dreams. But then I heard it, a small, deliberate snap of a branch close by, outside the cabin. I froze. I had no weapon, nothing to protect myself other than the small kitchen knife I had packed for food preparation. My mind raced, trying to rationalize the sound. A deer, perhaps? A raccoon? Something falling from the trees? The sound came again, louder, closer. I felt the panic rising, a weight in my chest. My hand went to the knife, gripping it tightly, knuckles white. I got out of bed slowly, trying not to make a sound. The cabin floorboards groaned under my weight, and I realized that any noise I made could give away my position. I walked to the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Peering through the dirty glass, I saw nothing at first. The clearing was empty, bathed in the dim light of the moon, which had risen and cast long shadows across the ground. Then I saw it, a figure, crouched low, moving silently between the trees at the edge of the clearing. It wasn't human, or at least not entirely. Couldn't tell. My heart pounded, and my breath came in shallow gasps. The figure didn't come closer. It stayed at the edge of the clearing, watching. I realized that running was pointless. The forest would swallow me in seconds. Hiding inside the cabin was the only option. I backed away from the window and grabbed my backpack. I had packed for the forest, not for survival, but I had a few things. The knife, a flashlight, a rope, some energy bars, and water. I decided to wait. The figure moved slowly, methodically, circling the cabin but never coming into the clearing. I stayed low, out of sight, and tried to remain calm, listening to every sound. Time passed slowly, every second stretching into minutes. My mind tried to make sense of it. I had never been this scared in my life, not in the city, not on my usual solo hikes. I realized how vulnerable I was. The figure didn't leave. It stayed, watching, moving just at the edge of visibility. Eventually, dawn approached, and the shadows of the trees began to shift as the first light appeared. With the light came clarity. The figure retreated slowly, back into the forest. I didn't move until I was certain it was gone. My hands shook as I packed quickly, leaving behind most of my belongings. I ran to the car, threw my bag in, and started the engine. I drove the narrow, winding path back down the mountain as fast as I could without losing control. My heart didn't slow until I reached the first paved road, and even then the tension stayed, a tight band around my chest. I never returned to that cabin. The memory stayed with me not as a nightmare, but as a lesson. The forest is quiet, beautiful, and sometimes peaceful, but it is also dangerous. Alone, unprepared, you are vulnerable in ways that are easy to forget. I learned to respect that, to prepare, and to always be aware of what might be watching when the world seems still. The cabin eventually faded from my life, replaced by other memories, but the sense of that night, of waiting in the dark while something moved outside my door, remains clear. I carry it with me, a reminder that isolation can be as frightening as any danger you imagine, and that survival is often about patience, awareness, and respect for forces bigger than yourself. From that trip, I became more cautious, more prepared, but also more aware of the fragility of solitude. It was not the end of my adventures in the woods, but it changed them. I no longer sought the silence for peace alone. I sought it with respect, with vigilance, understanding that the forest, the mountains, and even the smallest clearing can hold threats that are not imagined, but real. And that knowledge, terrifying as it was that night, became a tool for safety, a guide for every future journey. By the time I returned home, the sun was fully up, the city noise creeping back into my senses. I unpacked my things, cleaned up, and began writing notes about the cabin, the path, and the events of that night. I didn't want to forget, and I didn't want to underestimate the quiet of the forest again. In the end, the night had taught me more than fear. It had taught me how to survive, how to watch, and how to respect the power of the natural world. I stayed awake until dawn, barely moving. When light finally came, I went outside cautiously. Footprints, again, all around the cabin. But this time, they weren't alone. Someone had left other marks, smaller ones, that suggested someone had been crouching, looking inside the windows, testing the doors. My mind raced. How long had this person been watching me? How did they know I was alone? I packed up everything I could carry quickly. I didn't even eat breakfast. I decided to hike out the way I had come, hoping to make it back to the main road before they could see me leave. As I walked the trail back, I stayed alert, scanning the forest. Every shadow, every rustle made me jump. At one point, I thought I saw someone moving between the trees, but when I stopped and stared, there was nothing. My pace quickened. I knew the road was still miles away, and the terrain was steep and uneven. I had been on the trail for over an hour when I saw a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the trees near the clearing I had passed earlier. I ducked behind a tree, heart pounding. It was a person, tall, wearing dark clothing. They didn't move, just watched. I waited until they turned away, then ran the rest of the way, my legs burning, lungs screaming. By late afternoon, I finally reached my car. I didn't stop to rest. I jumped in and locked the doors, starting the engine immediately. The relief of seeing the paved road ahead, of leaving the isolation behind, was overwhelming. I kept driving, barely noticing the scenery, until I reached a small town where I could finally get gas and a hot meal. I called the police and reported what had happened, explaining everything about the footprints, the sounds, and the figure I had seen. They took a report and promised to send a ranger to check the area, though they warned me there was little chance of finding anyone. Over the next few days, I stayed with friends, avoiding the mountains. The experience had shaken me deeply, more than I expected. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to a confrontation, how isolated I had been, and how vulnerable a remote cabin could make a person. Eventually, I returned to the city, but the fear lingered. I avoided cabins, hikes, or any remote area for a long time. Months later, I heard from the local ranger station. They had investigated the area around the cabin and found signs of repeated trespassing. It seemed someone had been living in the forest near the cabin, hiding during the day and watching anyone who visited. They were never caught, but they had clearly moved on after I left. Knowing that I had been watched, that I could have walked out to my car and encountered them at any moment was chilling. But I also felt a sense of closure. I had made it out alive, unharmed, and I had acted quickly enough to avoid confrontation. The lesson was brutal but clear. Isolation can be dangerous, and vigilance is not optional. From then on, I never took solitude for granted. I learned to respect the wild, but also the people who might hide within it. I prepared more carefully for any trips, checked in constantly, and never underestimated the risks. The cabin, once a symbol of peace, became a reminder of how close danger can be when no one is around. I survived, and that survival changed me. It made me more aware, more cautious, and more grateful for safety. The mountains remained beautiful, the forest serene, but I never returned to that cabin. I didn't need to. The memory, vivid and raw, stayed with me, shaping how I approached solitude and how I measured risk. In the end, the story had a clear ending. I escaped, I lived, and I learned to never take isolation lightly. I had been looking forward to a quiet weekend in the cabin for months. Life in the city had worn me down. The constant noise, the endless deadlines, the sense that no matter how hard I worked, nothing ever truly changed. I had chosen a small, isolated cabin up in the mountains, a place that promised peace and solitude. The photos online made it look perfect, surrounded by dense forest, a small creek nearby, and a dirt road leading to it that ended in a small clearing where the cabin sat. It was rustic but sturdy, with a wood stove, running water, and electricity from a generator. I packed my car carefully, making sure to bring everything I might need. Extra blankets, food that could last for days, a few books, a first aid kit, and my backpack with hiking essentials. I even brought a small axe and some firewood just in case. The plan was simple: leave Friday afternoon, arrive before sunset, and spend the weekend alone in silence, hiking and reading, perhaps even just sitting by the creek listening to the water run. The drive itself was long, winding through stretches of road that seemed endless and lined with tall pines. As I climbed higher, the air grew cooler and smelled of damp earth and needles. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was dipping behind the mountains, painting the sky with streaks of orange and purple. I parked at the edge of the clearing and stepped out, stretching after the long drive. The air was crisp and smelled of pine and wet leaves. The cabin looked just like the photos, small, sturdy, with a porch that had a single rocking chair. The forest around it was dense, and the creek at the edge of the clearing murmured quietly. I unloaded my things and brought them inside, lighting the small oil lamp I had brought with me. The cabin felt warm and comforting, though there was a faint chill from the mountain air. I started by unpacking methodically, putting food in the small pantry, setting up the blankets, and preparing the wood stove. I had a small fireplace in the corner of the cabin, and I laid out a few logs to start a fire. I wanted the cabin to feel lived in, even if I was alone. After a quick meal of canned soup, I settled by the fire with a book, listening to the creek outside. The quiet was profound, almost unnerving at first, but eventually, it became soothing. Around 10 o'clock, I crawled into bed, feeling the comforting weight of the blankets, and drifted off to sleep. Morning came slowly. Sunlight filtered through the cabin windows in uneven beams, and I could hear birds calling in the forest. I made a small breakfast, a mix of oats and canned fruit, and packed a small bag with water, a flashlight, and a map of the area. The first hike was easy, a trail that followed the creek upstream. The forest was thick, the ground soft underfoot with fallen leaves and pine needles. As I walked, I felt the kind of quiet that only comes when there are no cars, no distant city noise, nothing but the wind and the occasional bird or squirrel. I felt safe in that moment, almost too safe. By midday, I had returned to the cabin, hot and tired. I started preparing lunch, a small sandwich and more water. As I ate, I noticed the wind had picked up slightly, rustling the trees outside in a way that seemed louder than it should have. I shrugged it off. Mountain winds were normal, after all. But later, when I stepped outside to fill my water bottle at the creek, I noticed something odd. The dirt path that led into the forest, the one I had followed on my hike, was disturbed in a strange way. There were faint footprints, not mine, that seemed fresh, heading toward the cabin. At first, I thought maybe an animal had passed, but the prints were too deep and defined. I frowned, crouching to examine them more closely. They were human, small, like someone who wore boots, but small. I checked around the cabin. No one else was in sight. I convinced myself it was probably a hiker who had passed by the cabin earlier, someone from a nearby trail I hadn't seen. I went inside, locking the cabin door as an extra precaution, though I knew it wasn't really necessary. The afternoon passed slowly. I tried to read, to ignore the footprints, but every so often, I found myself looking out the window at the forest, half expecting to see someone standing among the trees. I even started moving some of the furniture closer to the windows so I could see outside more easily. Night fell quickly, and I built a fire in the stove, listening to it crackle and watching the shadows dance along the walls. Around 10, I heard a noise outside, a soft, scraping sound on the porch. I froze, listening. It stopped as suddenly as it began. My heart was racing. I checked all the doors and windows. Everything was locked. I sat by the fire, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer brushing against something. Still, sleep did not come easily that night. The next morning, I woke to find something that made my stomach turn. Footprints circled the cabin, fresh ones, deeper than the day before, as if someone had walked around it while I slept. I could see the prints clearly in the soft dirt near the clearing. My hands shook slightly as I traced them with my eyes. Whoever had done this had been there during the night. I went outside carefully, my eyes scanning the tree line. Nothing. No one. The prints stopped abruptly at the edge of the forest. I felt the first true spike of fear. I checked the cabin again, making sure every lock was secure. I packed a small bag, thinking about leaving, but the nearest road was miles away, and with no cell service, I couldn't call anyone for help. I was alone, isolated, and someone had been outside my cabin while I slept. I spent the day cautiously. Every sound, crackling branches, rustling leaves, made my heart jump. I didn't want to leave the cabin, but I didn't want to be outside either. I spent hours barricading the doors with furniture, checking the windows, making sure the locks were secure. I even took the axe and positioned it near the door, feeling a small measure of security. When night came, I didn't sleep. I stayed awake by the fire, watching, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the door. My heart raced. I gripped the axe, crouching near the door. The steps stopped. I could hear breathing outside, faint, uneven. It went on for what felt like an eternity, maybe 10 minutes, before fading into the forest. I decided to make a plan. I spent the morning securing the cabin. I moved furniture in front of the doors, nailed down loose boards, and prepared an emergency kit in case I had to leave quickly. I also gathered rocks and heavy objects I could use for defense. The rational side of me hoped this was overkill, but the other side, the side that had been awake all night, knew I couldn't take any chances. That afternoon, I walked the perimeter of the property. The tracks were still there, faint but visible. I followed them cautiously, discovering that someone had indeed been near the lake the previous day. There were signs of a fire, small and poorly hidden. Whoever it was had been careful, but careless enough to leave traces. The reality sank in. I wasn't imagining it. Someone had been here and they might return. I spent the rest of the day preparing. I stacked firewood near the fireplace, ensured all the windows were locked, and kept a knife within reach. I ate a cold dinner, feeling the tension knotting in my chest. Night fell slowly, and with it came a storm. Rain pelted the roof, thunder rolled through the mountains, and lightning illuminated the forest in sudden bursts. The storm brought comfort and fear at the same time. It masked sounds outside, but it also meant that anyone approaching would be more desperate and reckless. The night was long. The storm raged until nearly morning, and with it, my fear grew. Every creak, every tap, felt like a threat. Around 3 a.m., I heard it again, a soft scraping, almost imperceptible, at one of the windows. I grabbed the knife and approached slowly, listening. There was nothing outside. The storm had masked most sounds, but the deliberate tapping continued, faint but certain. I retreated to the center of the cabin, heart racing, and tried to calm myself. I told myself it was the wind, branches, rain, but I knew better. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving the forest dripping wet and silent. I stepped outside cautiously, surveying the surroundings. The tracks were clearer now, and I saw something I had not noticed before. A small, crude campsite about 50 meters from the cabin. Someone had been here recently. There were remnants of food, a fire pit, and footprints leading toward the road. I realized then that I had to leave. Staying another night was too dangerous. I packed quickly, leaving as little evidence as possible that I had been there. The drive down the mountain was tense. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone following me. I stuck to the main road as soon as I reached it and drove directly to the nearest town. I stopped at the police station and reported the campsite, describing the cabin and the tracks. They took my statement seriously, noting that the area had seen reports of illegal campers and occasional break-ins. The rest of the weekend passed in a haze of tension and relief. I stayed in a motel, unable to shake the memory of the footsteps, the tapping, the feeling of someone watching me through the trees. The cabin was beautiful, isolated, and peaceful, but the isolation was a double-edged sword. It gave freedom but also vulnerability. I realized that in the wilderness, the line between solitude and danger was thin, and one misstep could leave you exposed. Weeks later, I returned to check on the cabin with the owner, who had secured it properly. The campsite was gone, but the evidence of human presence remained. The experience had left me shaken, but also wiser. I knew now how to prepare for isolation, how to secure myself, and how quickly the calm of nature could turn into fear when someone else had different intentions. I never stayed there alone again, and I always remembered that weekend as a stark lesson in the balance between freedom and safety. Even months later, the memory of that night stayed with me. The quiet before the storm, the subtle movements outside, the realization that being alone didn't mean being safe. But I also carried the knowledge that preparation, vigilance, and caution could turn fear into control, and that sometimes, surviving the night was about patience and awareness as much as courage. The cabin was no longer just a place of peace. It was a place that demanded respect, and I had learned that respect the hard way. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the endless noise, the blinking lights, the crowded streets, had filled my head for weeks. I had found a small cabin online, tucked away in the mountains, far from any main road, surrounded by forest that stretched for miles. The pictures showed a wooden structure, weathered but solid, sitting beside a quiet lake. From what I could see, it was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, peace, and the chance to breathe in air that didn't smell like exhaust. I left Friday afternoon. The drive was long, winding through narrow mountain roads that seemed to twist back on themselves in places. The further I drove, the smaller the towns became, until eventually there were only stretches of forest and the occasional farm with rusted fences and empty fields. I had packed carefully: food, water, a first aid kit, some tools, and extra blankets. The cabin owner had warned me that the nearest grocery store was over an hour away, and cell service would be patchy at best. I thought that was part of the charm. When I finally arrived, the sun was low, spilling orange light through the trees. The cabin looked even more remote than the pictures had suggested. A narrow dirt path led from the small parking area to the cabin door. The roof was covered in moss, and the wooden siding was weathered to a dull gray. I could smell pine and wet earth as I stepped out of the car. Everything felt quiet, almost too quiet. There was no wind, no birds, only the faint sound of water lapping against the lake. I unloaded my things and brought them inside. The cabin was small but cozy. The floor was wooden, creaking slightly under my weight. A stone fireplace dominated one corner of the main room. There was a small kitchen with basic appliances, a table, and 2 chairs. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The windows were thin, and some had cracks, but I could see the lake and the forest beyond. I unpacked my bags, set up my sleeping area, and then decided to explore outside. The first hour outside was peaceful. I walked around the cabin, noting the lake's edge and the forest path that wound into the trees. I could see deer tracks in the mud, and once I spotted a raccoon slipping through the underbrush. The forest seemed alive, and for the first time in months, I felt a calm I hadn't known I was missing. I stayed out long enough to watch the sun set, the sky turning shades of pink and purple before darkness settled over the land. That night, I made a fire in the fireplace. The crackling sound and the warmth of the flames were comforting. I had brought a small radio, though I knew there was little chance of picking up a signal. As the night deepened, I felt a thrill in the isolation, a strange mix of excitement and unease. There was a silence here that the city never offered, and with it came a certain vulnerability I couldn't shake. I was completely alone. I slept poorly. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle outside, made me sit up, heart pounding. I told myself it was normal, the wind, animals, but the unease didn't go away. By morning, I was on edge. I made coffee, then decided to walk along the lake. The path was narrow, overgrown, and muddy in spots from a recent rain. I could hear the distant sound of water running, though I couldn't see any stream. The forest was thick, the trees standing close together, their branches like twisted arms blocking the sun in places. It was around mid-morning when I first noticed something unusual. There was a faint smell, metallic and sharp, that didn't belong. I followed it cautiously along the path, keeping an eye out. The ground had been disturbed, as if someone had been digging. My stomach tightened. Whoever had been here wasn't recent. I couldn't tell how long, but the signs of human activity in this otherwise untouched area unnerved me. I turned back toward the cabin, trying to shake the feeling, but the unease didn't fade. When I got back, I checked the windows and doors. Everything was locked and secure, but a nagging thought lingered. Someone had been near the cabin. I spent the rest of the day keeping watch, peering through the trees. I didn't see anyone, but every shadow seemed to move differently than it should. I ate my lunch quickly, then stayed inside, keeping the fire going and listening intently for sounds outside. As night fell again, I tried to relax. I told myself the tracks and the smell could be from hunters, or perhaps someone camping illegally nearby. The logical part of my mind clung to that, but my gut was screaming that I wasn't alone. I double-checked all the locks, then sat by the fireplace, the flames throwing shadows across the walls. Every small sound made me jump. The wind rattling a loose shutter, a branch tapping the window. My senses felt heightened, raw. Around midnight, I heard it, a footstep on the porch. Slow, deliberate. I froze, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The door shook slightly under pressure, as if someone was testing it. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to think clearly. I grabbed the largest knife I had, crept to the window and peered out. The porch was empty. The wind? No, the snow hadn't fallen. The air was still. I backed away, heart hammering, and realized I couldn't stay inside the cabin without confronting the fact that someone might be outside. I waited, tense, through the rest of the night. Each sound was magnified. The distant cry of an animal, the rustle of leaves, the groan of the cabin settling. Sleep was impossible. By dawn, exhaustion had set in, but the fear had not eased. I ate breakfast mechanically, thinking about my options. I couldn't call for help. There was no cell service, and the cabin's landline, if it had one, wouldn't connect in this area. The only way out was the road, but it was miles of forest before reaching anything resembling civilization. The fifth day, I decided I could not wait. I had to leave. I packed quietly, keeping myself as calm as possible, and prepared to drive down the dirt road that led to the main road. Every sound of movement outside made my pulse spike. I waited until late morning, when the sun was high and the forest was bright, hoping the light would discourage anyone lurking nearby. I grabbed my pack, camera, and essentials, checking the locks one last time. As I opened the cabin door, I froze. Footprints in the mud, 2 sets, freshly pressed, led away from the cabin, toward the main path. Someone had been very close. I walked quickly to my car, checking behind me at every step. Branches snapped, birds scattered, but no one emerged. I reached the vehicle, doors locked, engine ready. As I drove down the rutted path, I felt relief mixing with fear. The forest loomed on either side, the trees closing in like walls. Every shadow made me glance instinctively in the rearview mirror. I had no idea who had been there or why, but the feeling of being watched, of having my solitude violated, stayed with me. When I finally reached the main road, the sense of danger began to lift. Civilization appeared in the form of a small town, then a gas station, then signs of normal life. I stopped to breathe, still shaking. I thought about calling the authorities, but without concrete evidence or proof, what could I say? Footprints, shadows, noises. These could be dismissed as animals, imagination, or accidents. Yet I knew what I had experienced was real. Over the following days, I recovered physically, but the memory of the cabin haunted me. The fear, the sense of intrusion, the complete vulnerability, it stayed with me. I realized that the isolation I had craved had exposed me to the worst-case scenario. Someone else had been aware of me while I was completely defenseless. I later learned from locals that the area was known for occasional intruders, people hiding in the forest, sometimes violent, sometimes merely observing. The warnings I had read online had seemed overly cautious until I experienced it firsthand. Weeks later, I returned to the cabin, this time with authorities and neighbors. The footprints had long since vanished, but the marks of intrusion were still visible. Scratches on the side door, trampled leaves, broken branches. The investigation revealed signs that people had been living, at least temporarily, in hidden areas nearby. They hadn't left traces beyond what I had found, but the evidence confirmed my fears. I was lucky. I had left before anything could happen. The experience changed me. I still love the forest. I still seek solitude, but I now respect the danger that comes with complete isolation. I understand how quickly peace can turn into fear, how easily the mind can sense threats even when nothing seems obvious, and how essential preparation and vigilance are in truly remote locations. The cabin, once a symbol of escape, became a reminder of vulnerability. Now, when I plan trips to remote areas, I take additional precautions. I scout locations more thoroughly, keep communication devices ready, and ensure that someone knows my exact plans. I avoid going out alone at night, even when the woods seem empty. The fear I felt in that cabin is not something easily forgotten. It has etched itself into my memory, a reminder that in the wilderness, the line between solitude and danger can be frighteningly thin, and survival sometimes depends entirely on awareness, preparation, and timing. The good ending, I realize, was simply surviving. There was no dramatic chase, no confrontation, no heroics. The relief came from calm thinking, cautious planning, and the luck of having an escape route before the intruders could act. In retrospect, every decision mattered. Locking doors, avoiding unnecessary exposure, observing signs, trusting instincts. That cabin trip, intended for peace and quiet, became a lesson in the fragility of human safety in isolation. I returned home, shaken but alive, with a newfound respect for the forest, for solitude, and for the unpredictable presence of others who move unseen in the world. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. A cabin in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest town, surrounded by thick forest, was exactly what I needed to escape the constant noise of the city and the pressures that came with it. I wasn't looking for adventure in the sense of hiking or climbing. I just wanted solitude, fresh air, and the quiet that comes when you are utterly alone. I had chosen the cabin carefully, based on reviews, photographs, and maps. It was old but sturdy, made of dark timber with a tin roof that creaked slightly in the wind. A small creek ran nearby, and there was a dirt road that led up to it, though it was overgrown and barely maintained. The last 3 miles required a careful drive through rutted paths and fallen branches. The first few hours were peaceful. I arrived in the late afternoon, the sun low but still visible through the pines. As I parked, I noticed the way the shadows stretched across the ground, the way the light filtered through the tall trees, turning everything into jagged patterns on the forest floor. The cabin itself was exactly as pictured. Inside, the air smelled faintly of old wood, a mix of pine and the musty scent of winter stored in the beams and rafters. The floor creaked underfoot in certain places, and dust motes floated in the air like tiny stars. I spent the first hour unpacking, setting up a small camp stove, organizing my supplies, and checking the windows and doors. Everything was secure. Everything seemed normal, As night fell, the isolation began to sink in. The first sounds were natural. The creek gurgling over stones, the wind in the treetops, the distant call of an owl. I had brought a small firewood supply, and once I had a fire going in the stove, the cabin felt warmer, more manageable. I cooked a simple meal, sat near the stove, and felt a strange combination of relief and unease. Relief because I had achieved the solitude I craved. Unease because I was acutely aware of how completely alone I was. That first night passed without incident, though I woke more than once to strange noises outside. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, heavy footsteps in the distance. But each time I went to the window, there was nothing. I told myself it was an animal, probably a deer or a raccoon, something harmless, though the way the sounds moved unnaturally close to the cabin made my heart race. I slept fitfully, waking at intervals to the noises outside. By morning, I felt both exhausted and alert, the kind of alert that comes when your body hasn't fully trusted your surroundings for hours. The next day, I decided to explore the area. There was a small trail that led down to the creek, and I followed it for a couple of miles, noting how the forest thickened and how the shadows deepened with every step. I kept the cabin in sight most of the time, but noticed the sense of isolation growing stronger the further I walked. There were subtle signs that humans had been in the area. An old campsite, a broken fishing rod, a rusted tin can, but nothing recent. Everything seemed abandoned, left to rot. I returned to the cabin before sunset, noting the eeriness of the forest in fading light. That night, the noises became more pronounced. A branch snapped close to the cabin, then another, and I could swear I heard footsteps circling the perimeter. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, pulled the curtains, and sat as close to the fire as possible. The creek gurgled in the distance, and the wind howled, rattling the tin roof. Around midnight, there was a loud thump on the side of the cabin. My stomach tightened. It had not been an animal. No animal could produce that sound without leaving other traces. I stayed completely still, heart hammering, listening as the sounds moved along the walls, down to the back of the cabin, then stopped. Sleep was impossible. I watched shadows dance on the walls from the flickering fire, every creak of the floor or rafter sending chills down my spine. I realized finally that someone could be outside, but the thought of leaving the cabin at night, confronting whatever it was terrifying. I kept the stove lit, burning wood slowly, trying to convince myself that the sound of the fire masked other noises. I sat awake until the early hours, adrenaline making my muscles tense, my mind spinning scenarios of intruders or worse. The following day, I was more cautious. I decided to barricade the cabin as best I could, stacking firewood near the doors and using heavy furniture to reinforce weak points. I checked my supplies and ensured my phone had battery, even though there was little signal in the area. I explored only briefly, keeping the cabin within view. Every sound seemed amplified, the creak, the wind, the occasional rustle of leaves. That night, the noises returned, but this time, there was movement. I could hear deliberate steps approaching the cabin, pausing, retreating, circling. My stomach churned. I stayed low, behind the stove, trying to appear invisible. Eventually, the sounds faded into the wind, leaving only the creek and the creaking trees. On the third day, my anxiety escalated. The isolation that had once felt peaceful now felt suffocating. I became hyper-aware of every sound outside, every movement of light through the trees. I began noticing small details I hadn't before. Footprints in the soft dirt, slightly disturbed leaves near the edge of the cabin, and a faint smell of smoke that wasn't mine. Panic crept in as I realized someone had been near the cabin while I was away, though there were no signs of forced entry. I felt trapped, vulnerable, but also aware that leaving might draw attention. I spent hours scanning the surrounding forest, looking for anything unusual. Birds flew away at my approach, and squirrels disappeared, as if the forest itself were uneasy. The creek was louder now, or perhaps it just sounded louder because my nerves were frayed. I tried to ration my movements, staying inside as much as possible. Food and water were limited, and I realized that I might have to stay longer than expected. The isolation which I had sought now became a trap. On the fourth night, I noticed someone was watching. Through a small gap in the curtains, I saw a shadow move among the trees, too tall to be a deer, too deliberate to be random. My heart hammered. I backed away, confirming that my doors were locked. The shadow lingered for hours, disappearing whenever I moved the curtain, reappearing when I looked elsewhere. Sleep was impossible. I spent the night sitting on the floor, back against the wall, staring at the small gap through which the shadow appeared. I wondered if I would survive until morning, if I could even leave safely. By nightfall, I had resorted to sitting by the fire with an axe close by, my eyes darting constantly to the dark windows. I could hear movements outside, distant and near all at once. Something was out there. I didn't know if it was an animal, a person, or just my imagination, but I felt the primal need to survive taking over every rational thought. I realized that no one knew I was here. No one would notice if I didn't return for weeks. The thought was suffocating. I couldn't risk wandering outside, couldn't risk leaving any light on for too long. Every instinct screamed that the cabin, my refuge, was now also my trap. Morning brought a strange sense of relief. The sun broke through the trees, spilling light across the clearing. I could see tracks in the dirt, too large for deer, irregular, something else entirely. My stomach sank. I realized that staying was dangerous. I had underestimated the isolation, the forest, the unpredictable threats it could hide. I packed supplies quickly, keeping my axe in hand, ready for anything. I considered my escape route carefully, tracing the path back to the main road. I would need to move fast, quietly, and without leaving any clue that I had been here. The walk back through the forest was tense. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow seemed to move toward me. The tracks I had seen near the cabin seemed to follow me intermittently, vanishing and reappearing in ways that unsettled me further. My heart raced, but I kept moving. I remembered the creek and followed its edge for a while, knowing water sources often gave a sense of direction. Hours passed, but I forced myself not to look back. I focused only on the road ahead, only on the faint glimmer of the sunlight through the trees. When I finally reached the dirt road where I had started, I broke into a run. My car was parked exactly as I had left it, but I approached cautiously, checking the underbrush around it. Nothing. I unlocked the doors, slid inside, and started the engine. The relief was almost overwhelming. As I drove back toward civilization, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the forest. But the road was empty, quiet, nothing chasing me. I stopped several times along the way to calm myself, to breathe, to let the tension drain. The experience had left me physically drained and mentally shaken, but I was alive. The cabin, the isolation, the forest. It had all tested me in ways I hadn't anticipated. But I had survived by staying calm, observing carefully, and trusting my instincts. I realized that nature could be beautiful and deadly at the same time, that solitude carried its own dangers, and that the human mind could magnify fear in ways almost as terrifying as reality itself. When I finally returned home, I left the cabin behind completely. I didn't take photos or make notes. I didn't try to rationalize the experience too much. I just appreciated being around people again. The small, mundane sounds of life in the city. The hum of traffic, the chatter of neighbors, the ringing of my phone. I slept in a real bed that night, under a roof I trusted, and felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The memory of the cabin lingered, the darkness, the wind, the sounds, the fear, but it no longer had power over me. I had faced isolation and the unknown and had come out whole. The experience taught me something fundamental. Fear is real, but survival depends on staying alert, staying calm, and making rational choices even when the mind screams otherwise. I would never return to that cabin, never seek out that kind of solitude again, but I would carry the lessons with me. Real danger isn't always dramatic or cinematic. Sometimes it's quiet, creeping, patient, and it tests you in ways you never thought possible. I had faced it alone and I had survived. That knowledge, that clarity was my victory. I had been driving for hours before I even saw the cabin. The road had narrowed into a winding dirt path, flanked by dense trees that blocked almost all sunlight. My phone's GPS had been useless for at least the last 20 miles, and I had begun relying on the paper map I had printed weeks before. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, tucked deep in a remote part of the forest I had never visited before. The idea of solitude had drawn me here. I had wanted to escape the constant noise of the city, the blinking notifications, the people always demanding attention, always needing something. I didn't even think twice about being completely alone. In fact, I had been looking forward to it. The forest itself had been alive in a quiet, almost oppressive way from the moment I entered. The wind rustled through the treetops, low and constant, and every so often a bird would call out, sharp and high-pitched, then vanish again into the canopy. I could smell the damp earth and decaying leaves beneath the trees, a smell that felt strong and ancient. The dirt road I was driving on was littered with branches and stones, and as I drove, the tires crunched over each one, echoing in the heavy silence. I began to notice other sounds. Small, subtle things at first. A scurrying in the underbrush, something hitting a tree branch, distant thumps that could have been falling limbs or an animal. I brushed them off, telling myself it was the forest settling around me, and I had nothing to fear. When I finally saw the cabin, it was worse than I had expected. In the photos online, it had looked cozy, inviting, almost charming. Here, in real life, it seemed smaller, more dilapidated. The wood siding was gray and weathered, the roof sagging in the middle, shingles missing. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them, and the air smelled faintly of mildew and smoke. The windows were dusty, some with cracks, and I could see nothing of the inside from the outside. I had come prepared, bringing groceries, water, and firewood, but seeing it now, I felt a wave of doubt. I parked the car to the side and grabbed my bag. I walked up the steps, each creak echoing far too loudly in the empty forest. I unlocked the door. It resisted at first, sticking in the frame, before I pushed it open with effort. The smell inside was stronger, a mix of damp wood and old dust. The floor was uneven, and as I stepped inside, I immediately noticed the cabin smelled of mold. The windows were covered in grime, letting in only slivers of light. The cabin was small, a main room with a kitchenette, a table with a few chairs, a small wood stove, and a loft above that served as a bedroom. There was a bathroom, tiny, with an old sink and a toilet that didn't flush well. The walls were cracked in some places, and the ceiling beams looked fragile. Despite this, I felt a strange sense of relief. I was here. I was finally alone, finally in silence. I unpacked my supplies, laid out my food, and started a fire in the stove. The first night was unnerving but manageable. I had brought a flashlight, a couple of candles, and plenty of blankets. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the windows, and I could hear branches scraping against the cabin walls. Every sound was amplified, every small creak or pop echoing in the darkness. I reminded myself that old cabins make noise, that I was safe inside. I went to bed early, feeling the tension in my shoulders slowly unwind as I drifted off to sleep. The next day, I explored the area. The forest around the cabin was dense, with narrow trails barely wide enough for me to walk through. There was a small creek nearby, water running clear and cold over rocks. I filled my water bottles and marked my path, making a mental note of landmarks to avoid getting lost. While walking, I saw signs of wildlife, deer tracks, a fox den, bird nests, but nothing too close to the cabin. The solitude was peaceful at first. I chopped some firewood, stacked it neatly by the stove, and started organizing the inside of the cabin, sweeping dust from the floor and checking for any structural weaknesses. It was during the second night that the real fear began. The wind had turned harsh, shaking the cabin violently at times. The trees groaned and cracked, and I could hear the branches thrashing against the roof. It sounded like someone, or something, was walking on the roof. I tried to convince myself it was just branches, but the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My flashlight revealed nothing outside. The forest was an impenetrable darkness beyond the small clearing around the cabin. I felt trapped, the isolation suddenly feeling dangerous rather than peaceful. Sleep was impossible. Every snap of a twig, every sudden gust of wind made my heart race. I kept the fire burning through the night, its orange glow providing some comfort against the oppressive darkness outside. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps around the cabin, but when I shined the flashlight in every direction, nothing was there. The forest was empty, or at least it appeared so. I told myself I was imagining it, that fear was magnifying normal sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. By the third day, exhaustion was settling in. My muscles ached from chopping wood and hauling water. My mind strained from constant vigilance. I started noticing subtle things that unnerved me. The door handle slightly moved when I wasn't near it, faint marks on the steps I hadn't seen before, the feeling that the shadows outside shifted just slightly when I looked away. I checked the locks obsessively, bolted the doors and windows, and even set up makeshift barriers using chairs and logs. The isolation was warping my perception. I began to hear patterns in the wind, almost like whispers, but each time I focused, it was just the sound of trees and leaves. The fourth day brought a near panic. I had gone out to collect more firewood and had ventured further than I had before. When I returned, I noticed the cabin looked slightly different, or maybe it was just my mind. A log I had stacked neatly the night before was on the floor. The window that I thought I had shut tightly was slightly ajar. The door was locked, but I could swear the bolt had shifted. I checked every corner, every closet, and nothing seemed missing. Nothing seemed moved beyond what I had noticed. Still, the sense of unease was growing. The forest was too quiet now, the natural sounds subdued, almost absent. As I was loading my car, I noticed something else. Fresh markings on the trees, not far from the cabin, like someone had been tracking me, leaving signs that they had been there or might come back. I didn't wait. I started the car and drove carefully along the wet, muddy dirt road, constantly checking the forest behind me in the rearview mirror. Every shadow looked like someone moving, every distant sound made my heart jump, but I kept driving, refusing to stop until I reached the main road. The drive back to town was tense. Every few minutes, I caught glimpses of movement between the trees, shadows that didn't belong, and my imagination ran wild. I didn't stop for anything until I reached a gas station at the edge of town. I pulled in, heart racing, and finally allowed myself to breathe. The clerk looked at me strangely as I bought water and a map, but I didn't care. I just needed to be out of the woods, away from that cabin and whoever had been watching it. Later, I reported the footprints and markings to the local authorities. They said there had been reports of transient criminals using abandoned cabins to hide or ambush people, but they never found anyone in that particular area. They advised me to avoid the forest alone in the future. I never returned to that cabin. Even weeks later, I couldn't shake the memory of that night. The way the footsteps had circled the cabin, the cold weight of fear pressing down on me, and the realization that someone had been intentionally watching and waiting. I would never forget it, and I never will. It changed the way I saw isolation, the forest, and the idea of safety. Some places, I realized, were not meant to be alone, no matter how peaceful they seemed. From that experience, I learned a few things I hold to this day. Always trust your instincts, always assume someone could be watching, and always have a way to get out, because when you are alone in the wilderness, there is no one to protect you except yourself. The fear I felt that night was raw, unfiltered, and utterly human, and even now, years later, I can still feel the damp cold of that cabin, the shadows in the trees, and the sound of deliberate, measured footsteps circling just outside. I had been driving all day to get to the cabin. The road had narrowed into a gravel path, and the trees closed in on either side, their thick branches forming a kind of tunnel over the car. The sky was overcast, the sun fading behind thick gray clouds, and the air smelled damp, like the way Earth smells right before rain. I had rented this cabin for the weekend, somewhere deep in the woods, away from anyone else. I had wanted solitude, a break from work, from people, from everything. But as I turned the corner and saw the cabin for the first time, I felt a pang of unease. It was exactly as the pictures had shown. Small, wooden, isolated, with peeling paint on the walls and a little porch that creaked with the wind. But seeing it in person, I realized just how alone it really was. There were no neighboring houses, no distant roads, no sounds of civilization, just the trees, the gravel road, and the cabin. I parked and got out, my boots crunching against the gravel. The air was cool and heavy, pressing down with a kind of weight that made me feel small. I grabbed my backpack and my duffel bag from the trunk, checking that I had everything: water, food, clothes, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. The cabin had electricity, supposedly, but I didn't want to rely on it entirely. The forest around me felt alive, but not in a comforting way. It wasn't the sound of birds or rustling leaves that I was used to. There was an undercurrent of something else, a subtle movement in the trees that I couldn't place. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was just tired from the drive. Inside, the cabin was small but functional. A main room with a small kitchen, a fireplace, and a table. 2 bedrooms, one of them with a loft above it, and a bathroom with a shower. The wood smelled faintly of rot and dust, and the floorboards creaked under my weight. I set down my bags and walked around, checking the doors and windows. They were all old and rickety, but they closed. The lock on the front door looked worn, but functional. I told myself I'd be fine. The first night was uneventful. I made a small fire in the fireplace, ate some canned soup, and read a book until my eyes grew heavy. The wind was stronger outside now, rattling the windows, and the occasional branch scraped against the roof. I went to bed early, partly because I was exhausted, and partly because I wanted to get an early start on the hike I had planned for the next day. Around 3 in the morning, I woke to a sound. At first, I wasn't sure what it was. A thump, or maybe a scrape, coming from somewhere outside. I froze, straining to hear. The wind was still blowing, but this didn't sound like the wind. It sounded deliberate. I lay there for what felt like minutes, my ears straining, heart pounding, but I didn't hear it again. I told myself it was a branch falling or some animal moving through the underbrush, and eventually, I forced myself back to sleep. The next day, the sun came through thin clouds. I made breakfast and planned my route. The forest surrounding the cabin was dense, full of undergrowth and towering trees. The map I had printed showed a small trail not far from the cabin, leading to a ridge with a view of the valley below. I set off mid-morning, carrying a backpack with water, snacks, and a small pocket knife. The trail was narrow and overgrown, and soon I realized I had passed where the path was marked on the map. I tried to backtrack, but everything looked the same. The trees, the moss-covered rocks, the uneven ground. After an hour of wandering, I realized I was lost. I tried to stay calm. I remembered the basics. Follow water, stay put if necessary, mark my trail. I found a small stream and decided to follow it downhill, thinking it might lead to the road or back to the cabin. The forest grew thicker, darker, and the air colder as the clouds above thickened. After a few hours, I saw a fallen tree across the stream. As I stepped over it, my foot slipped on the wet moss, and I twisted my ankle. Sharp pain shot up my leg. I gritted my teeth and sat down, trying to keep calm. My first instinct was panic, but I knew I had to think rationally. I could feel my ankle swelling, and it was difficult to put weight on it. I had to get back to the cabin before nightfall. I tried hopping carefully, using a branch for support, but soon the pain was too much. I sat down again, breathing heavily. The forest was silent now, the kind of silence that presses against you, filling your ears with the absence of sound. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, but when I turned my head, there was nothing. I realized I had no choice. I had to stay put until morning. I found a spot under a large pine tree and used my backpack as a cushion. I wrapped myself in my jacket, trying to keep warm as the temperature dropped. The wind blew through the trees, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine needles. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my heart jump. Hours passed slowly, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. At one point, I thought I heard footsteps. Not the soft padding of an animal, but deliberate, heavy steps. I froze, straining to listen. They stopped after a moment, I told myself it was probably an animal, but I couldn't be sure. By dawn, my ankle was worse, but at least I could see better. I tried to follow the stream again, hoping it would lead me somewhere familiar. Hours passed. My feet were wet, my hands scratched from branches, my stomach growling. The forest seemed endless, the trees indistinguishable from one another. I tried shouting, but my voice was swallowed by the thick woods. Eventually, I reached a clearing. There, to my relief, I saw the outline of a dirt road. It was faint and overgrown, but unmistakable. I limped toward it, leaning heavily on my branch. My leg burned, and my arms ached from the effort, but the sight of the road was like a lifeline. I followed it, hoping it would lead to the cabin or at least a place where I could get help. Hours later, I saw the cabin again, like a mirage. I almost couldn't believe it. I stumbled the last few meters, collapsed on the porch, and just lay there, gasping for air. The relief was overwhelming. I checked the doors and windows again. Everything was exactly as I had left it. Nothing had moved inside. The isolation I had wanted now felt unbearable, but I had survived the forest. Over the next day, I rested. I cleaned myself up as best I could, using bottled water to wash the dirt and blood from my scraped hands and legs. I made sure the firewood was stacked, the fireplace ready, and I organized my supplies. I realized how vulnerable I had been and how careful I would need to be for the rest of the weekend. I made sure to keep a flashlight and my phone close, even though the signal was weak. That night, I stayed alert. I slept in short bursts, waking at every sound, every rustle, every whisper of wind. I reminded myself that I was alone, and that the forest was full of things that could hurt me if I wasn't careful. The fear was constant, gnawing at the edges of my mind, but I managed it. I stayed focused on practical concerns: food, warmth, safety, and my own physical limits. By the fifth day, the cabin felt like a trap. I had enough food and water to last longer, but I was on edge constantly. Every shadow became a figure, every sound a potential intruder. I started keeping my backpack packed near the door, knife in hand, ready to run if necessary. That night, the noises came closer. I heard scraping along the front porch, then a loud thump against the door. I gripped the knife, my muscles tight with tension. I didn't open the door. Instead, I waited. The sounds faded slowly, and when I dared to look, there was nothing outside. The sixth day, I decided I had to leave. I couldn't endure the constant tension any longer. I packed quickly but carefully, leaving no trace that I was there. I moved quietly, checking the woods for any sign of someone following me. The drive back on the dirt and gravel road felt endless. Every shadow in the trees seemed alive, every rustle of leaves a warning. My adrenaline was high, my nerves raw. When I finally reached the paved road and drove into the small town, the relief was almost overwhelming. I parked at a gas station, still trembling, and realized how tense I had been for days. The town felt safe, alive, and noisy in a way that was comforting. I bought some water and food, and for the first time in nearly a week, I allowed myself to relax. I called a friend to tell them I was okay, carefully leaving out the full story, but making sure someone knew I had returned. Over the next few weeks, I thought about the cabin constantly. The isolation, the sounds, the feeling of being watched, and the mysterious marks in the dirt haunted me. But I also realized that the experience had changed me. I had survived days in extreme isolation, had kept myself alert, and had made the right choices under pressure. I learned the importance of preparation, of being vigilant, and of trusting instincts. The woods were beautiful and peaceful during the day, but at night, they could be unforgiving and dangerous in ways I couldn't fully predict. I never went back, but I never forgot the lessons I learned. And more importantly, I knew I had faced fear and survived on my own, and that knowledge stayed with me, sharp and clear, reminding me of the line between caution and panic, between vigilance and terror. The cabin stayed behind me, hidden in the forest, untouched and quiet, but in my mind, it was never empty. I never saw anyone, and I never found a concrete explanation for the noises or the footprints. But the certainty that I had endured, that I had left safely, gave me closure. I learned that fear could be a guide, that careful observation and calm thinking could save a person in situations that seemed impossible, and that sometimes survival was about patience, vigilance, and leaving when the time was right. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep in the forest, miles away from the nearest town. I wanted solitude, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears and fills the spaces between your thoughts. The map I had printed out showed only the main road leading to the forest entrance, and after that, a thin line marking the narrow dirt trail that would take me to the cabin. I packed carefully, double-checking everything. Extra food, water, a first aid kit, a flashlight with spare batteries, a small axe, and a hunting knife. I didn't want to be unprepared for anything. The drive there took longer than I expected. The asphalt ended abruptly, and the car bounced over rocks and potholes. Every few miles, the trees closed in, creating long shadows even though the sun was high. Birds flew overhead, and once in a while, I saw a deer vanish into the undergrowth. The forest was dense, untouched, and quiet in a way that felt unnatural. The kind of quiet where you start listening to your own breathing and footsteps like they are someone else's. When I finally reached the clearing where the cabin stood, I parked and stepped out. The air was cold, even though it wasn't late in the season. The cabin looked older than I imagined. Its wooden walls were weathered, some of the planks warped or slightly rotten, but it was solid. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, though I knew no one was supposed to be there. The front door creaked as I pushed it open. Dust rose in small clouds, and the smell of old wood and damp earth filled the cabin. The windows were grimy, making the sunlight that filtered through look yellow and muted. I started my inspection. The cabin had a small kitchen with a rusty stove and a sink that still had running water from a shallow well outside. There was a wood-burning fireplace in the living area, and the floors creaked under every step. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, the beds sagging and covered in thin, faded blankets. I unpacked my bag, set my food and water on the counter, and checked the flashlight and knife once more. Then I went outside to gather wood for the fire. By the time night fell, the forest had completely changed. The sunlight had vanished, leaving only blackness and the dim light of the moon. I lit the fireplace, and the cabin slowly warmed. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the trees and making the branches scrape against the walls. It was the kind of sound that gnaws at your nerves if you sit quietly long enough. I ate a simple meal and then sat on the old couch watching the flames flicker. It started as a feeling subtle at first. I couldn't put a finger on it, but the sense that I was not alone grew heavier as the night deepened. The wind had died down, but now I could hear other sounds. Small branches snapping, leaves rustling, a faint scuffing like shoes on the forest floor. I told myself it was the wind, deer, or small animals, but the sounds were too irregular, too close. I stood and walked to the window, peering into the darkness. I saw nothing, only the black outlines of trees. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow in the room seemed to shift when I blinked. Every noise outside made my heart leap. I kept reminding myself it was just an empty forest, that the isolation was part of what I came for, but the tension built like a storm inside me. Around midnight, I decided to check the perimeter. I grabbed the flashlight and the axe and stepped outside. The forest at night is completely different. The shadows are deep, and every rustle seems louder, sharper. I swept the light across the clearing, then followed the narrow trail leading slightly into the trees. It didn't take long before I saw something that made my stomach tighten. A set of footprints in the dirt, too large to be a deer, heading directly toward the cabin. I froze. They were fresh, probably from the last hour. I ran back inside, bolted the door, and checked all the windows. None were broken, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming. I spent the rest of the night sitting by the fire, knife in hand. Every sound was magnified. The crack of the firewood, the scurrying of what I hoped was small animals, the occasional creak of the cabin floor under its own weight. Dawn could not come fast enough. Morning brought no relief. The footprints were still there, partially washed away by dew, but unmistakably human. Whoever had walked there hadn't tried to hide it. That alone made my anxiety spike. I decided I had to leave, but the trail back to the main road was long, and I needed daylight. I packed quickly, leaving behind nothing but a small amount of food and the fire smoldering in the fireplace. As I stepped outside, I saw movement among the trees at the edge of the clearing. Shadows too big to be a rabbit or fox. I froze again, heart hammering. They didn't move closer, just lingered, watching. I gripped the flashlight and the axe, trying to appear confident, and began walking briskly toward the trail. The forest was silent now, almost unnaturally so. I forced myself to focus on the path, stepping over roots and rocks. By late morning, I reached the end of the trail and got my first clear view of the dirt road. Relief washed over me. I ran the last few hundred meters to my car. I looked back once and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, motionless. I didn't stop to analyze it. I jumped in the car, locked the doors, and drove away, adrenaline fueling my escape. The next morning, I made a small plan for hiking closer to the cabin, exploring only short distances and always marking my route. I carried extra water, more food, and the small first aid kit. I avoided steep slopes and thick undergrowth, staying on the edges of the paths where the ground was stable. The sense of unease never left me, but it became more manageable, more like a background noise than a pressing terror. By the third day, I had grown accustomed to the rhythm of the forest. I still checked the doors and windows constantly, I still kept my gear close, and I still jumped at sudden sounds, but I felt more capable. I explored small sections near the cabin, finding a few clearings, a patch of wild berries, and a spot by the stream where the water was clean and calm. I kept notes in a small notebook, observations, routes, times, and weather. I told myself I was preparing, not panicking. On the fourth day, I ventured slightly further along the main trail, testing my ankle. It was slow, careful walking, but manageable. I found a small rock formation that offered a view of the surrounding forest. The expanse of green was calming, but it also reminded me of just how alone I was. I took pictures, marked the trail with small pieces of string, and returned to the cabin before the sun began to set. The final night was quiet. I had learned to listen to the forest without letting it unnerve me. I had organized my things, ensured I could leave quickly if necessary, and accepted that this solitude was part of the experience I had sought. Sleep came more easily, though I kept my flashlight and knife within reach. When morning arrived, I packed up, double-checking everything. The drive back to civilization was long, but uneventful. I kept thinking about how close I had come to real danger, not from ghosts or fantasy creatures, but from the forest itself. Its isolation, its ability to disorient, its quiet threats. By the time I reached a gas station and saw other people, other cars, and the sound of civilization, I felt a wave of relief unlike anything I had experienced before. Looking back, the cabin trip had been terrifying, exhausting, and humbling. It reminded me of the fragility of human life in the wilderness, the importance of preparation, and the reality of fear when it comes from natural, real sources rather than imagined ones. I had survived by staying calm, thinking logically, and respecting the environment around me. The fear never left entirely, but I carried it with a newfound sense of respect rather than panic. I had faced the wilderness alone, and I had come back whole, stronger, and aware of both the dangers and the beauty that exist when one steps into a world untouched by humans. I drove through the winding forest roads for hours, the GPS signal dropping in and out as I got deeper into the mountains. The sun was already low when I finally spotted the cabin, a small, weathered structure tucked between tall pines, far from the road. It wasn't on the map, but I had found it online through a rental listing that promised complete seclusion and quiet. That's exactly what I wanted. I wanted to disappear from the noise of the city, from people, from responsibilities. The moment I parked, the stillness hit me. It was heavier than I expected, almost pressing against my chest. No Vertsang. No wind whispered. only the faint creaking of the cabin boards in the late afternoon light. I unlocked the cabin door and stepped inside. The air was cold and smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. Dust coated the corners and the furniture was sparse. A small table, 2 chairs, a wooden bed frame with a thin mattress, and a rusty stove in the corner. I dropped my bag on the bed and walked over to the window. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction. Nothing moved. The silence felt alive, like it was watching me. I tried to shake off the unease. I lit the stove to warm the cabin, unpacked my supplies, and made myself a simple dinner. Even while eating, I kept glancing at the window, half expecting something to appear between the trees. Of course, nothing did. After eating, I cleaned up and decided to explore the surrounding area before it got dark. The sun was almost gone when I followed a faint trail behind the cabin. It wasn't a proper path, just the occasional clearing between thick underbrush. I moved carefully, listening to my own footsteps. Every crack of a branch underfoot made me jump. The shadows were long and uneven, and every tree looked like it could hide someone or something. I told myself it was just my imagination, that humans aren't meant to be afraid of trees, but the fear was stubborn. As the last light faded, I turned back toward the cabin. That's when I noticed footprints in the soft soil near the clearing, fresh footprints. Not mine. They were large, heavy, and too deep to be animal tracks. My stomach twisted. Whoever had made them hadn't gone far, and they were heading toward the cabin. I didn't have a cell signal, and my car was down the narrow forest road, hours away from anyone who could help. My mind raced. I ran back to the cabin, heart hammering. Inside, I locked the door and bolted the windows. I grabbed a flashlight and checked the perimeter, but the forest was impenetrable. I couldn't see more than 10 feet in any direction. The footprints had disappeared. I tried to calm myself, but the hair on my arms and neck stood on end. Every tiny noise, twigs snapping, leaves rustling, felt amplified. Night came fully, and the darkness was absolute. I stayed in the cabin, listening, waiting. Hours passed. I tried to sleep on the bed, but the fear made my body tense and restless. I kept imagining someone outside, watching, waiting for me to relax. Then I heard it. A slow, deliberate scratching at the cabin door. Not a branch, not an animal. Someone was testing the lock. My heart stopped. I grabbed a kitchen knife, barely able to control my shaking, and pressed my back against the wall, peering through a tiny crack in the door. Nothing. The scratching stopped as abruptly as it started. I sat in silence for what felt like forever, the knife tight in my grip, ears straining for the slightest sound. Then, suddenly, I heard footsteps on the roof. They weren't light. Someone heavy, pacing slowly. My stomach dropped, and I realized the vulnerability of the cabin. Thin walls, creaky roof boards, no way to escape silently. Panic surged. I remembered the old hunting rifle in the corner. I didn't even know if it worked, but I needed it. I lifted it and checked the chamber. It was loaded. I kept moving it slowly, making sure I stayed out of sight of the windows. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, miles from the nearest road, and the idea of being alone in the forest appealed to me more than I could explain. I wanted silence, isolation, the kind that forces you to notice every sound, every movement around you. I thought I was prepared. I had checked my gear, packed enough food and water, and made sure the cabin was stocked with basic necessities. It was an old hunting cabin, simple wood construction, nothing fancy, but it had a fireplace, a small kitchen, and a loft that served as the sleeping area. The surrounding forest was dense, thick with pine and spruce, the ground carpeted in needles that muffled footsteps and hid roots and rocks that could trip you if you weren't careful. The hike to the cabin took longer than I expected. The trail, overgrown in some parts, was barely more than a path carved out by previous hikers or hunters. I kept thinking I had misjudged the distance, but the map on my phone confirmed I was heading in the right direction. Still, the forest grew quieter the deeper I went. Birds that had been singing in the morning had vanished. The wind, usually a gentle hum through the trees, was now barely noticeable. I felt a creeping sense of being watched, not by a person, but by the forest itself. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be, and the slightest movement of leaves or branches made me stop and hold my breath. I reminded myself it was just my imagination, that the forest was alive in ways I wasn't used to, and that there was no reason to be afraid. I reached the cabin just before nightfall. Its wooden walls were weathered, gray, and cold to the touch, and the roof sagged slightly in the middle. I unloaded my backpack and started unpacking, stacking firewood near the fireplace and filling the water container from the nearby stream. The first night was unsettling. I slept lightly, listening to the strange calls of owls and the rustle of something moving outside. Each time I woke, I checked the windows. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees like towering figures, and I felt small, exposed, vulnerable. The second day, I decided to explore the surrounding area. I found a small clearing a few hundred meters from the cabin, and the sight of sunlight filtering through the trees was a relief. I marked the perimeter, noting landmarks so I could find my way back. I thought I was careful, but the forest had a way of making all directions look the same. Twisting trails, shadows that moved with the wind, and uneven ground made navigation tricky. I kept a steady pace, aware that losing track of time or place could be dangerous. On the third night, the feeling of unease returned stronger than before. I was sitting by the fireplace, eating a simple meal, when I heard a snapping sound outside. Not the usual crack of a branch breaking under wind or an animal, but something heavier, deliberate. I froze, listening. Another snap, then silence. I stayed alert, moving quietly, making sure everything outside was as it should be. The darkness pressed against the windows. I didn't sleep that night, instead sitting awake, listening to every shift in the shadows, every gust of wind, every distant sound. By the fourth day, I noticed something unusual. Supplies I had left in a small storage area by the cabin seemed slightly moved. Nothing major, just a little out of place. A bag shifted, a jar tipped on its side. I was sure I had placed them carefully, and I was meticulous about keeping track of everything. I checked the cabin thoroughly, the locks on the doors, the windows. Everything was secure, yet the sense of intrusion remained. It was unnerving, subtle at first, but I couldn't shake it. My mind raced through explanations. Perhaps an animal had entered, or maybe I had misremembered. But the more I checked, the more I noticed small signs that something wasn't right. On the fifth day, I left the cabin to collect firewood and check the water source. I carried a knife this time, and I kept scanning the surroundings constantly. The forest seemed quieter than usual. Too quiet. No birds, no insects, just the faint rustle of leaves when the wind moved. I reached the stream and filled my water containers, noticing that the usual animal tracks in the mud were absent. That was odd. There were usually deer or rabbit tracks, but I pushed the thought aside. I hiked back slowly, constantly aware of every sound, and when I neared the cabin, I noticed footprints leading toward the cabin that were not mine. They were heavy, boot-like, and I could see the tread pattern clearly in the damp earth. My heart began to race. I retraced my steps, checking the trees and underbrush, but there was no one in sight. It was just the footprints, heading straight toward the cabin. I didn't go inside immediately. I circled the cabin, looking for signs of entry. The windows were all intact, the door firmly shut. Nothing obvious, yet the sense of being watched was undeniable. That night, I barricaded the doors and windows as best I could, piling heavy furniture against the entry points. I slept with my knife beside me, keeping the flashlight within arm's reach. Every noise outside startled me. Every shadow in the corners of the cabin became a potential threat. My sleep was shallow, restless, punctuated by moments of panic whenever a branch snapped or an animal cried in the distance. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cabin was small, isolated, and deep in the woods, far enough from the nearest town that cell service was unreliable. I had been careful in choosing it, looking for a place where I could completely disappear for a couple of days, away from work, people, and everything that felt suffocating in my life. The drive had been long, winding through dirt roads and dense forest, and by the time I arrived, the sun was low, sending long shadows across the clearing where the cabin sat. The structure itself was rustic, made of dark, weathered wood, with a steeply pitched roof and a small chimney that hinted at a working fireplace inside. It looked abandoned at first glance, though that was part of the appeal. I wanted quiet, and this cabin offered it in spades. I parked my car near the cabin and stepped out, taking a long breath of the cold, pine-scented air. The forest around me was quiet, almost unnaturally so, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes every small sound, like the distant rustle of a branch or a bird taking off, feel magnified. I carried my backpack with supplies and a small duffel with food and essentials, checking that I had my flashlight and first aid kit before stepping toward the cabin. The door was old but sturdy, with a heavy latch. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and dust, and a faint, lingering dampness clung to the corners. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I moved carefully, exploring the small space. There was a main room with a fireplace, a small kitchen area with a sink and cabinets, a tiny table and chairs, and a loft above that served as the bedroom. A bathroom with a shower was tucked to one side. The cabin had no electricity except for a few wall-mounted lanterns and a single solar-powered lamp that barely lit the space. I set my things down, unpacked some food, and started a small fire in the fireplace. As the sun disappeared completely, the woods outside grew darker and more oppressive. Shadows moved strangely between the trees, and the wind, though not strong, pushed through the gaps in the walls and the roof, making a low whistling sound. I ate a quick dinner and decided to explore the property before night fully fell. There was a small path leading away from the cabin that disappeared into the trees, and I followed it for maybe 100 yards before the undergrowth became too thick. Something about the way the forest closed in around me, the way every crackle of leaves under my boots sounded louder than it should, made me feel uneasy. I told myself it was just nerves, the isolation playing tricks on my mind, and I returned to the cabin, locking the door behind me. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every sound outside, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, made me sit up in bed and listen. The wind picked up, rattling the window frames, and somewhere deep in the woods, a branch cracked sharply. I told myself it was a deer or some other animal, but my imagination was running wild. I kept thinking about how far I was from help, how easy it would be for something to go wrong. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my fear, and I dozed fitfully, waking intermittently to the sounds of the forest. The next day, I tried to distract myself with chores and exploring. I stacked firewood, cleaned the small kitchen, and walked along the edge of the clearing, taking in the beauty of the surrounding trees and the distant hills. The woods were quiet, almost too quiet, and the more I wandered, the more I noticed small details. A tree stripped of bark, footprints that looked too large and human-like to be from deer, and a broken branch that seemed to have been bent deliberately. I shrugged it off, telling myself I was imagining things, but an uneasy feeling clung to me all day. By the afternoon, clouds rolled in, and the weather began to shift. The wind picked up, and the first fat drops of rain fell. I returned to the cabin, closed all the windows, and built a larger fire in the fireplace. The storm began in earnest that evening, rain pounding the roof and lightning flashing through the gaps in the trees. I sat close to the fire, listening as the storm rattled the cabin, feeling both safe and trapped at the same time. There was something oppressive about being cut off from the world, knowing that help was hours away if anything went wrong. Around midnight, I heard it, a loud, deliberate knock on the cabin door. My heart stopped. The storm had been raging so hard that I hadn't expected anyone to be out here. I froze, listening. The knock came again, louder and more insistent this time. I told myself it had to be a branch or something the wind was moving, but the sound had a definite rhythm, too deliberate to be random. I grabbed my flashlight and walked slowly toward the door, trying not to let my fear show. I peered through the small window, shining the light outside, but the rain and darkness made it impossible to see anything. I waited, straining my ears. The knocking stopped, but then, from the woods just beyond the clearing, I heard something that made my stomach turn. Footsteps, crunching over wet leaves, moving deliberately closer to the cabin. I backed away from the door, heart racing. My mind ran through every possible scenario, every survival tip I had ever read. I grabbed the small hatchet I kept near the fireplace for emergencies, my hands shaking as I held it in front of me. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, and then, faintly, I heard breathing. Not animal breathing, heavy and deliberate, and it sent a chill down my spine. The storm raged outside, masking the sounds, but I knew I wasn't alone. I had prepared for emergencies, kept a charged phone in my backpack, a flare gun tucked in a drawer, and a knife. But nothing could prepare me for the immediate, primal fear of realizing someone was out there, watching. Hours seemed to stretch. Every time I thought the footsteps had stopped, I heard them again, circling, approaching, retreating. I didn't sleep at all that night, sitting in the corner near the fire, gripping the hatchet, listening to the storm and the footsteps in equal measure. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving a wet, heavy silence in the forest. I cautiously peered outside and saw footprints in the mud, human footprints, circling the cabin. They were large, booted, and unmistakably deliberate. Whoever had been out there had walked around the cabin in the night, leaving no other trace that I could see. Panic rose in my chest, but I forced myself to think clearly. I packed my things quickly, double-checking that nothing was left behind, and decided to leave immediately. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The porch was disturbed. Footprints in the mud, scratch marks on the wood. Someone had been there overnight. I searched the perimeter, but there was no sign of them now. I gathered what I could carry, knowing I couldn't stay. I had enough strength to climb the ridge and reach the main road if I moved carefully. I packed essentials into my backpack. Water, a few cans of food, my flashlight, my phone. Even though the signal was weak, I kept it on. I left everything else behind. The hike out was brutal. The forest was thick, the path winding, and my body was tense with exhaustion and fear. I moved slowly, carefully, constantly listening for sounds behind me. At one point, I thought I saw movement between the trees, but it was gone when I looked directly. I told myself to stay calm, to focus. After hours of trudging through mud and underbrush, I finally saw the faint outline of the road. My pace quickened. I stumbled onto the gravel, my boots sliding on loose rocks. I stopped and looked around. Nothing. No footprints, no sign of anyone following me. The safety of the road, the open space, felt unreal after the oppressive isolation of the cabin. I finally reached a small town a few miles down the road. I found a gas station, used their phone, and called the local authorities. I reported the cabin, the footprints, the sounds, everything. They took my statement and promised to check it out. Later, I learned that the cabin had been targeted before by trespassers. Thieves looking for isolation and easy targets. They often avoided the main roads, watching for anyone renting the place, then creeping in at night. The cabin was eventually abandoned again after my report. In the end, I was safe, but the experience stayed with me. I had gone seeking peace and solitude, and I found it, but in a way I never expected. The forest, the isolation, the people watching, it all left a mark on me. I realized that even in the most beautiful, remote places, there is danger. Even when you are alone, you are not always alone. And some of that danger is not from nature, but from other people. I never returned to that cabin, and I never plan to. I still think about it sometimes. The smell of the fireplace, the quiet of the forest, the shadows moving at the edge of vision. But I also remember the relief of walking back to the road, the sun rising, and the knowledge that I survived. That clarity, that survival, became more valuable than any solitude I had sought. The story ended with me moving on, more cautious but wiser. I learned to respect the isolation of nature, to understand the vulnerability that comes with solitude, and to prepare for the unexpected. I didn't need to see ghosts or magic to feel fear. I didn't need fairy tales to understand danger. The reality was terrifying enough, and surviving it made the experience unforgettable. The forest remained quiet, beautiful, and dangerous, but I learned to carry a piece of caution, awareness, and preparation wherever I went next. I remember the first time I decided to go to that cabin, deep in the mountains. I had been looking for a place that would let me disconnect from everything. The city, the noise, people, deadlines. I had been overworked for months, stressed out by small failures at work, and a constant feeling that I was slipping through life without control. The idea of a week alone, surrounded by nothing but trees, a small creek, and the cold mountain air, felt like the perfect escape. I found the cabin online on a small rental site. The pictures showed a simple wooden cabin, old but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a porch that looked like it could hold 2 chairs and a small table. It was a few miles off the main road, reachable by a dirt path that wound through the forest. The description promised privacy and quiet, and it said the cabin was stocked with essentials: firewood, a small kitchen, blankets, and even an old generator. The reviews were minimal but positive. I convinced myself it would be peaceful. The drive was long, longer than I expected. The last stretch was nothing but gravel roads, lined with towering pine trees that blocked out most of the light. By the time I arrived, the sun was low, casting long, dark shadows that stretched across the path. The cabin looked even smaller in person than it did in pictures, but it had a charm to it. It was worn and weathered, but it had a solidity that made me feel it would hold up against the mountain winters. I parked my car near the porch and stepped out. The air was crisp, almost cold, but clean in a way the city never was. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled of old wood and faint smoke, like someone had used the fireplace recently. There were dust motes in the sunlight, drifting lazily in the air. I started exploring. The cabin had a small living area with a couch and a few chairs, a small table, and a fireplace. The kitchen was tiny but functional, with a stove, a fridge, and shelves stocked with some canned goods, plates, and utensils. There were 2 bedrooms, each with a single bed and thin blankets. I unpacked my bag, leaving just a few essentials on the table: water, snacks, a flashlight, and a small first aid kit. I had packed light, thinking I would only be here a week, but I made sure to bring extra clothing, boots, and some sturdy gloves. I filled the water jug from the tap in the kitchen. It tasted clean, almost metallic, but not unpleasant. That first night, I lit a fire in the fireplace. The wood smelled smoky and dry, and the flames crackled warmly. I stayed awake for a while, listening to the wind moving through the trees. It was a constant, low rustle like whispers. At first, it was calming, but after a few hours, the sound began to feel strange, almost deliberate, as if something in the woods was moving just beyond my sight. I told myself it was just the wind, just the way the forest made noises, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I tried to sleep, but it was fitful. Every crack of a branch outside, every sudden gust of wind made me sit up in bed. The next morning, I decided to explore the area around the cabin. There was a small creek a few hundred feet from the porch. The water ran clear, cold, and fast over rocks, and I could see small fish darting beneath the surface. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush. I hiked a little along the creek, marking my path so I could find my way back. Everything seemed normal, quiet, untouched, but there was a sense of isolation that pressed against my chest. The kind of isolation you only feel when there are no roads, no people, no lights for miles. I spent the rest of the day unpacking supplies, stacking firewood, and cleaning the cabin. I found that the generator worked, though it was old and rattly. I tested it briefly, making sure I could run a few lights if I needed to. I also found a small emergency radio tucked in a drawer. It was old, but it turned on and I could hear static between channels. I didn't know how much signal I would get out here, but at least it was something. By evening, I had made a small routine. Firewood stacked, generator tested, a simple meal prepared on the stove. I felt a little more comfortable, though the wind still made odd sounds, and the shadows outside seemed longer and darker than they should have been. Over the next 2 days, I settled into a rhythm. I hiked a little each day, exploring the forest, following animal tracks, and taking photographs. I noticed deer tracks near the creek and occasionally spotted a fox slipping through the underbrush. The quiet was both soothing and unsettling. I could hear everything: The wind in the trees, the crack of branches, the soft babbling of the creek, the distant call of a bird. On the third night, as I lay in bed listening to the wind, I heard something that made me freeze. It was a snapping sound, very deliberate, close to the cabin. Not a branch breaking in the wind, but a crisp snap, like someone stepping on dry wood. I held my breath, trying to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but it came again, louder and closer. I got up and grabbed the flashlight. My heart was racing, but I told myself I had to check. I stepped onto the porch and swept the beam through the trees. Nothing, just shadows and the dark outlines of the forest. I stayed there for a while, listening. The snap came once more, followed by a low, dragging sound. Something heavy moving through the underbrush. I stepped back inside and locked the door. My rational mind told me it was probably a bear, or maybe some hikers who had gotten lost. But the sound of heavy footsteps circling the cabin all night made it impossible to sleep. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch had me holding my breath, waiting. By the fourth day, I began to realize just how unprepared I was for isolation. I had brought food, but not enough for emergencies. I had tools, but nothing strong enough to protect myself if someone or something tried to break in. I noticed footprints near the cabin in the morning. They were too large and human-shaped to be deer or elk. Fresh footprints, leading from the tree line toward the cabin and back. I checked the perimeter. Nothing obvious, no signs of forced entry, no movement. I tried to convince myself that the forest animals had made them, but I knew better. Someone had been here. I spent the next day barricading the doors and windows with whatever I could find. I moved furniture in front of them, nailed boards across the more accessible windows. I made a list of supplies in case I had to leave quickly. I rationed the remaining food and water. I avoided hiking too far, staying close to the cabin, always watching the tree line. Every little sound made me jump. The wind, a branch snapping, the creek moving. I couldn't trust the radio. The channels only brought static and, occasionally, far-off voices that were too weak to understand. That night, the sounds came again. This time, I could hear deliberate steps circling the cabin, slow and heavy, like someone testing the structure, testing me. I didn't sleep at all. I stayed crouched in a corner of the main room, flashlight in hand, listening to the night. At some point, I heard a metallic scrape, like something sharp being dragged across the wooden porch. I realized someone was trying to get in. My chest felt tight, panic squeezing every muscle. I thought about calling for help, but I knew the cell signal was weak at best. I had to wait until morning. I stayed awake, alert, and cold. The fear was physical, crawling under my skin. Weeks later, I learned that the cabin had a history I hadn't known. People had reported break-ins and robberies in the surrounding forest. The area was used by a group that targeted travelers who ventured too deep. My instincts and preparation probably saved me. The authorities said that trespassers sometimes stayed hidden for hours, watching, studying, waiting for a chance. I realized how close I had been to encountering someone dangerous without a chance to react. After that trip, I never went back to that forest. I took up hiking closer to populated areas, never again seeking isolation so deep it became dangerous. I also invested in better planning, carrying a GPS, a satellite phone, and notifying local authorities whenever I went into the woods. The experience taught me a lesson about respect for the unknown and the dangers that exist in places that seem empty but aren't. Even now, months later, I sometimes see shadows in the corner of my eyes when I walk through wooded areas, or I hear footsteps behind me on quiet streets. The memory of those footprints at my cabin lingers, a reminder that some threats aren't supernatural. They are human, real, and patient, and they are always watching. I had been planning this solo trip to the cabin for months. I needed a break from the constant noise of the city, the deadlines, the constant hum of people and traffic. The cabin itself was tucked away in a dense forest in northern Minnesota, about 3 hours from the nearest small town. It was accessible only by a narrow, winding road that eventually dissolved into dirt and then into a barely noticeable trail through the trees. I had taken the drive countless times in my head, imagining the sight of the forest closing in around me, the isolation that I had craved for weeks. I had packed my car with everything I thought I might need. Food for a week, enough water, firewood, a first aid kit, and the one thing I insisted on bringing that I knew most people might scoff at, a heavy-duty hunting knife. Not for hunting, but for protection. I knew better than to rely on anything else when I was so far from help. The drive itself was long and tiring. The city had not yet let go of the day's heat, and as I passed the last stretch of suburban neighborhoods, I felt a strange relief knowing I was leaving civilization behind. Once the asphalt ended and the gravel began, I felt my tension begin to ease. The road narrowed to a single lane in places, flanked by thick stands of pines that seemed to lean in over the car. Every bend revealed more shadows, more trees, and eventually more silence. I kept my music off for most of the drive. The quiet itself was almost loud, pressing in on me from the windows, reminding me that once I reached the cabin, the only sounds would be the wind, the birds, and whatever animals lived in those woods. I arrived at the cabin just as the sun was dipping low behind the hills. It was smaller than I remembered from the pictures, but sturdy, made of dark-stained logs, with a metal roof that had seen better days, and a porch that sagged slightly on the right side. I parked my car near the small clearing in front of it, trying to ignore the feeling that I was being watched, a feeling I would come to know well over the next few days. I unloaded my supplies slowly, checking that nothing was missing, and carried the heavier bags inside. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and dust, and there was a lingering scent of something more subtle, like damp earth. The windows were dirty, and the floors creaked under my weight. I set down my bags and did a quick inspection of the interior. 2 small bedrooms, a modest kitchen, a living area with a stone fireplace, and a bathroom with running water, though I suspected it might not be reliable for long. Everything seemed in order, though I could tell the place hadn't been lived in for months. That first night, I slept lightly. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar but soothing at first. The rustle of leaves, the occasional call of an owl, the skittering of small creatures along the roof or walls. But as the night grew darker and colder, I began to hear noises I couldn't identify. At first, I tried to rationalize them. Maybe the wind moving through the trees, maybe a branch falling. But as the hours ticked by, the sounds became sharper, more deliberate. A scrape along the side of the cabin, a faint thump, almost like footsteps circling outside. I grabbed the knife I had placed beside the bed, my heart hammering, and strained my ears to hear better. Eventually, the exhaustion overcame my fear, and I slept fitfully. The following morning, I woke before sunrise, the cold air from the single small window brushing against my face. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. The forest was dense and dark even in the early morning light. I walked carefully around the building, noting footprints in the dirt. At first, I thought they were my own from unloading supplies, but then I noticed they led away from the cabin toward the trees and returned on the other side. I felt a wave of unease. I knew that in these woods, wildlife could easily leave prints, but these seemed too deliberate, too human-like. I decided to inspect further. The underbrush was thick, and I had to push branches aside to see anything clearly. The footprints were gone after a short distance, leaving only the impenetrable wall of trees and shadows. I returned to the cabin, my stomach tight with a sense of foreboding I couldn't shake. The days passed slowly. I made a routine of chopping firewood, drawing water, cooking simple meals, and exploring small parts of the surrounding forest during daylight hours. I told myself the fear was just the result of isolation, that being alone made my imagination run wild. Still, each night, the noises returned. Sometimes it was the scraping against the walls, sometimes the soft crunch of footsteps in the leaves, and sometimes a faint, almost imperceptible whisper of movement near the window. I never saw anyone, and that made it worse. I kept my knife close, and I started keeping the fire burning longer into the night, even when the cabin was warm enough. I would sit on the sagging couch, the shadows of the trees flickering against the walls from the firelight, and listen, waiting, convinced that at any moment, someone or something could appear in the darkness just beyond the windows. On the 4th night, I heard something different. A low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled across the ground, circling the cabin. I froze, my hands gripping the knife so tightly my knuckles went white. The sound stopped, and the forest returned to its normal nighttime rhythm. I convinced myself it was a fallen log or some animal. But then I noticed a faint impression in the dirt near the back porch. Someone had been there. The marks weren't fresh, but they were recent enough for me to see the outline clearly in the moonlight. Panic surged, cold and sharp, and I moved the furniture to block the door, checked the locks, and stayed awake the rest of the night, barely breathing. The next morning, I decided to investigate the trail leading away from the cabin. I needed to understand if this was an animal or if someone had been in the woods. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and difficult to follow. Every few steps, I checked the underbrush for movement, my pulse high. I followed the trail for nearly 2 hours, taking careful notes of any tracks or disturbances. I found nothing that could explain the marks clearly. No obvious footprints, no trash, no sign of camping. But the trail did seem well used, as if someone passed through regularly. I started to think about the stories I had heard of people living off the grid in these woods, and I felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that it might not be a threat. Dread at the realization that if it was a person, I was alone, unprotected, and deep in their territory. That evening, as I sat by the fire, I began to hear voices. Not real voices, but faint sounds carried by the wind. Words I couldn't understand, but that seemed deliberate. My heart raced. I checked all the windows, peered into the darkness, and found nothing. The feeling of being watched returned, more intense than before. I moved the furniture closer to the doors and windows again, sharpened my knife, and stayed alert. I barely slept, dozing in short bursts. Hours passed like this. Every sound made me flinch. By the time I heard the first hint of dawn, I was physically exhausted, but I hadn't slept a second. The footsteps on the roof were gone. The scratching had stopped, and the forest was quiet again. I forced myself to breathe normally and wait until full daylight. Once the sun rose, I worked up the courage to check outside. There were footprints leading up to the cabin, circling it, and then disappearing back into the trees. Whoever had done this had been around me all night. I felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. My instincts screamed to leave immediately, but I needed a plan. I couldn't run blindly into the forest. I had no way to navigate. I needed to get to my car safely. I packed all my things, keeping the rifle at the ready. I waited until I saw clear daylight, then slowly stepped outside. I moved carefully, checking the tree line constantly, ready to fire if anyone appeared. The footprints were gone, as if whoever it was had vanished, but I didn't dare linger. I kept low, moving from tree to tree, back toward the road. Every shadow felt like movement. Every sound made me spin around. I didn't look back. Finally, I reached my car. Relief hit me like a wave, but I stayed alert. I kept the rifle across my lap and drove slowly, scanning the road. Nothing followed me. The closer I got to civilization, the lighter my chest felt, though the memory of those footprints and the night in that cabin stayed with me. I reported the incident to the local authorities once I reached cell service. They told me they would check the area, but there hadn't been any prior reports of break-ins or trespassing in that remote spot. They warned me not to return. I agreed immediately. The thought of being in that cabin again, knowing someone had been circling it while I slept, was unbearable. I never went back to that forest. The fear didn't leave me for weeks. Every creak in my apartment, every shadow in my yard, triggered that memory. I realized how easy it is for someone to disappear into the woods and remain undetected. I also realized how unprepared I had been, alone in the dark with no one to help if something went wrong. The experience taught me a hard lesson about isolation and caution. I now carry a sense of vigilance whenever I'm in unfamiliar or secluded places, and I never underestimate the dangers that exist outside civilization. The cabin, which once promised solitude and peace, had become a vivid memory of fear and the fragility of safety.